The morning Daniel Arroyo found the door, he almost walked past it. He was 43 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades carrying things heavier than he should have alone. His boots were worn at the toe. His jacket had a tear along the left shoulder that he kept meaning to patch. He had been a ranger with the Federal Wilderness Service for 19 years, stationed at a remote outpost in the high country of the Sierra Madre Occidental, where the pine forests grew so thick and old that certain trails had not seen another human boot print in years. He was not a man given to daydreaming. He was not the kind of person who looked at rocks and imagined faces, or studied clouds for shapes. He was methodical, trained to read the land the way other people read text, picking up meaning in details that had no obvious voice. That was why, when the cliff face caught his attention, he stopped. He had been walking the Eastern Ridge Survey route, the same circuit he covered every 3rd week, checking trail conditions, logging erosion, noting any signs of illegal cutting or poaching activity. The route took him along a limestone shelf that jutted from the mountainside like the brow of something enormous and sleeping. He had walked it dozens of times. He knew every fissure, every overhang, every scrubby juniper that had somehow rooted itself into a crack barely wider than a finger. But he had never noticed the door. It was set into the cliff at ground level, half buried under a slide of loose shale and decades of accumulated pine needles. The wood was dark with age, almost the same color as the stone surrounding it, which was likely why it had passed undetected for so long. The frame was hewn from timber so dense and hard it had not warped despite what must have been many, many seasons of freeze and thaw. Iron hinges, heavy and forged rather than cast, held it in place. A single ring of black metal served as a handle. Daniel crouched down and cleared away the debris with his gloved hands, moving slowly, the way he did around anything he didn't yet understand. The door was maybe 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, built for a person who expected to enter on their knees, or built so small that it was never meant to be noticed at all. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. There was no signage, no warning, no indication of who had put it there, or when, or why. The cliff behind it was solid limestone, part of a formation that ran for several kilometers along the ridge. There were no caves marked on any survey map he had ever studied. No historical records mentioned anything built into this section of the range. He pulled out his radio and checked the signal. 2 bars, barely enough to be useful. He thought about calling it in, filing a report, waiting for someone else to come and take over the discovery. That would have been the correct procedure. Instead, he took a photograph with his phone and tried the handle. The ring moved. Not easily, not without resistance, but it moved, rotating a quarter turn before stopping against some internal mechanism. He pulled. The door shifted, dragging against packed earth, and then with a sound like a slow exhale, it swung outward. Cold air came with it. Not the cold of an empty space, but the cold of something deep, something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Daniel switched on his headlamp and leaned forward into the opening. The beam cut into darkness that seemed to pull at it, thick and close. He could see rough stone walls, a floor that dropped slightly and then leveled, and beyond that, a passage that extended farther than the light could follow. He stayed there for a full minute, breathing steadily, doing the kind of mental accounting he had learned to trust. He had water for 3 hours. His emergency beacon was on his belt. He had reported his route that morning and would be expected back by 5. It was just past 10. He had time. He went in. The entrance was tight. He had to duck and angle his shoulders sideways, and for a moment the rock pressed close enough on both sides that he felt the particular cold sweat of enclosed spaces, a sensation he had never fully made peace with despite years of working underground in emergency scenarios. Then the passage widened, and he straightened, and the discomfort passed. The floor was not bare stone. That was the first thing that registered clearly once he was fully inside. It was flat, worn smooth by use. And along the left wall, barely visible beneath a thin layer of grit, were the marks of a tool. Regular, deliberate marks, spaced evenly, the kind left by someone who had spent a long time shaping a rough surface into something level and useful. Someone had worked this space. The passage ran for roughly 30 feet before opening into a chamber. Daniel stepped into it and swept his headlamp in a slow arc. The ceiling rose to perhaps 10 feet. The walls were irregular stone on 3 sides, But the fourth wall stopped him cold. It was built, not carved from the cliff. Built, brick by brick, using a pale mortar that had long since gone gray and hard. The construction was precise and confident. The bricks were large, handmade, the kind pressed from local clay and fired in a kiln. They formed a wall roughly 15 feet wide and solid as anything he had seen, bisecting what might have been a naturally larger cave behind it. And in the center of that wall was another door, larger than the first, reinforced with iron bands across its face. Fitted with a lock mechanism so complex, it would have looked more at home in a bank vault than in the side of a mountain. Daniel stood in front of it for a long time, long enough that the cold began to work its way through his jacket. He placed his palm flat against the door's surface and felt. Nothing moved, nothing shift. Whatever was on the other side was sealed completely. He turned and took a careful inventory of the chamber. In one corner, a rotted wooden crate had long since collapsed under its own weight. Whatever it once contained merged with the floor. Beside it, a rusted lantern hook had been driven into the stone wall. On the built wall itself, to the right of the door, someone had scratched text directly into the mortar. Daniel leaned close and read it. The characters were a mixture of Spanish and something older, symbols he did not immediately recognize, interspersed with letters from a script that looked like it might be an indigenous writing system. He took several photographs, careful to hold the light at an angle that brought out the depth of the scratched marks. At the bottom of the inscription, clearly legible, was a date, not in any ambiguous format. Just 4 digits, 1847. He stood up slowly. His back ached from bending. His mind was doing something it rarely did, racing ahead of the available information, constructing possibilities before the evidence was gathered. He pressed it back. He was a ranger. He documented. He reported. He did not speculate. He took 40 photographs before he left the chamber, covering the entrance door, the passage, the chamber walls, the built wall, the lock, and every detail of the inscription. Then he backed out into the daylight and stood on the ridge breathing the sharp pine air and thinking about what he had just seen. By the time he reached the outpost, he had made a decision. He would file the report, but he would write it carefully, with the kind of precision that left no room for dismissal. Because he already knew, from 19 years of experience, that the people who sat behind desks had a particular skill for making inconvenient discoveries disappear behind paperwork. The report took him 3 hours to write. He was not a man who struggled with words under ordinary circumstances, but this required a different kind of care. Too much enthusiasm, and they would assume he had been out in the altitude too long. Too little detail, and the discovery would be logged as a minor survey anomaly and forgotten. He had seen both happen before, not with anything like this, but with archaeological finds, with undocumented springs, with evidence of old settlement patterns that deserved study and instead collected dust on a hard drive somewhere. He settled on precise and dry. He described the location using GPS coordinates. He documented the construction of the outer door, its materials and condition, its probable age based on the style of the hardware. He described the passage, the chamber, the built wall, the interior door. He included all 40 photographs and a rough sketch of the spatial layout. He sent it to his regional supervisor, a man named Osvaldo Fuentes, who had been managing the district office in the city for 11 years and who Daniel respected as a careful, unhurried thinker. He also sent a copy, quietly, to a contact of his at the National Cultural Heritage Authority, a woman named Esperanza Vidal, who had spent most of her career cataloging colonial-era sites across the western mountain range. Then he went to bed, though sleep came in pieces, interrupted repeatedly by the image of that date scratched into gray mortar. He knew enough history to understand what that year meant in this part of the country. The land had been in upheaval. Old colonial structures were collapsing. New governments were uncertain and unstable. The mountains had become a place where things were hidden, where powerful interests buried what they could not carry and hoped to come back for it later. Sometimes they came back. Often they did not. Osvaldo called him the next morning before 8. The tone of the call was the first sign that something was different. Osvaldo was a methodical man. He usually began conversations with procedural matters, checked in on routine items, and worked toward the main subject at his own pace. This time he skipped all of that. "Where exactly are you on this, Daniel?" he asked. Daniel told him. Osvaldo was quiet for a long moment. "And you went inside alone." It was a statement, not quite a question, and not quite a reprimand. I had water, beacon, and time, Daniel replied. I was careful. I need you to go back today, Osvaldo said. Not inside, just to the site. I'm dispatching 2 people from the Heritage Office, and I want you there to meet them. Don't discuss what you found with anyone else. Do you understand me? Daniel understood. When Osvaldo said, don't discuss it with anyone else, he meant don't let word spread before the official channels had time to form a perimeter around the information. It was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was the kind of careful management that kept fragile discoveries from being picked apart by everyone with an interest or an agenda before anyone had a chance to protect them. He was back at the ridge by mid-morning. He sat on a flat rock near the outer door and waited. The wind moved through the pines below him. A hawk quartered over the open slope to the south. The cliff face behind him was as silent and unremarkable as it had ever been from a distance. The 2 people from the Heritage Office arrived 4 hours later. They had driven to the trailhead and walked the last 3 kilometers in, which explained the time. One was a young man named Raphael, an archaeologist who introduced himself with a handshake that lingered a beat too long, the kind of grip that communicated either nerves or excitement, possibly both. The other was older, a woman named Miriam, who said almost nothing, looked at the outer door for about 45 seconds, and then began photographing it with a camera that made Daniel's phone look like a toy. She did not ask him many questions. She looked at his photographs on his phone and made a sound in the back of her throat that could have meant many things. She examined the hinges with a loupe. She scraped a tiny flake of the mortar from inside the passage and placed it in a sealed glass vial. The lock on the inner door is the issue, she said finally, not to Daniel specifically, but not excluding him either. It's post-colonial. Probably mid-19th century, possibly later. The mechanism is sophisticated. Someone with resources put this here. Raphael was sketching in a notebook, moving quickly, his pencil covering the page with measurements and notations. Someone with resources who wanted what's inside to stay inside, he said. Or someone who wanted to be the only one who could get it back out, Daniel said. Both of them looked at him. Neither disagreed. It took another 2 days before anyone from above Osvaldo's level got involved. When they did, the pace of things changed entirely. A vehicle arrived at the trailhead carrying 3 officials Daniel had never seen before, 2 from the cultural ministry, and one who identified himself with a title that meant very little to Daniel, but seemed to mean a great deal to everyone else. They spoke among themselves in low voices and consulted documents on tablets, and took the 3-kilometer walk to the site with the expressions of people performing an obligation rather than experiencing a discovery. Daniel watched them. He had been asked to stay on site as the reporting ranger, which meant he had been given a front-row seat to something he was not entirely sure he was supposed to see. The conversation among the officials near the outer door was careful and brief. Then the man with the important title pulled Miriam aside and spoke to her privately. Daniel was far enough away that he caught only fragments. Protocol. Assessment period. Media management. That last phrase sat uneasily in his chest. He said nothing. He wrote down every detail he observed in his personal field notebook, the one he kept separate from his official duty logs, the one he had maintained for 19 years because he had learned early that official records had a way of reflecting what was convenient rather than what was true. That night, back at the outpost, he opened his laptop and spent 2 hours reading everything he could find about the region's history in 1847. He read about the movements of silver and gold through the mountain passes during the years of political transition. He read about the groups, some official, some not, who had used the high country as both a route and a refuge. He read about structures built during that period, some of which had been found, cataloged, and studied, and some of which remained unaccounted for in the historical record. He found one document, a digitized excerpt from a regional ecclesiastical archive, that mentioned a repository in the High Sierra, something described only obliquely as a place of safekeeping established by the diocese in the years of uncertainty. The document was dated 1851. It made no reference to a location. Daniel read that passage 3 times. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He was not a man who believed in signs. He did not think the hawk that had circled over him that morning was an omen, or that finding the door on that particular Tuesday meant anything beyond the accumulation of small factors that had led him to crouch down and look at the ground when he might have kept walking. He had found the door because he was attentive, because 19 years of reading the land had trained his eyes to catch irregularities that other eyes skipped past. But that document, that oblique reference to a place of safekeeping in the years of uncertainty, settled into him with a weight that was hard to dismiss. He thought about what lay behind that second door. He thought about the lock mechanism Miriam had described as sophisticated, about the resources that would have been required to construct a sealed chamber inside a cliff face in a remote mountain range in the middle of the 19th century. He thought about who would go to that kind of trouble and why. Then he thought about the officials who had arrived with tablets and careful voices and concerns about media management, and he felt the first slow movement of unease in his gut. The following morning, he drove to the nearest town with a reliable internet connection. The drive was 2 hours. He did it without telling anyone where he was going, which was within his rights during a rest day, though it felt deliberately unaccountable in a way he was not accustomed to. He found the email address for Esperanza Vidal, his contact at the Heritage Authority, and wrote her a second message. This one was not a formal report. It was a personal note, direct and specific, describing what had happened in the 2 days since his first report, including the arrival of the officials and the phrase media management. He did not know if she could do anything with it. He did not know if she would even respond. But something in him needed the information to exist somewhere outside of the official channels. He hit send and drove back to the outpost. Esperanza called him that evening. She did not waste time. She had read his reports, both of them, and she had made some inquiries of her own. The site, she told him, was already being discussed at a level above the cultural ministry. There were people involved whose primary concern was not the preservation of whatever lay behind that door. What is their concern? Daniel asked. She paused before answering, choosing words. There are things in that mountain range, she said, that have been the subject of competing historical claims for a very long time. Whoever controls the documentation of what you found controls the narrative of what it means and who it belongs to. He let that settle. So what do I do? She told him, and it was not what he had expected. Don't go back to that site without a written request, she said. Document every communication you receive about this through official channels. Keep your personal notes separate. And if anyone asks you to sign anything that limits what you can say publicly, don't sign it. He thanked her and put the phone down. He sat at the small table in the outpost kitchen and looked at his hands, rough and calloused, the hands of someone who had spent 2 decades doing work that most people were glad someone else was doing. He had found something. He was almost certain now that what lay behind that inner door was significant in a way that dwarfed the bureaucratic machinery already mobilizing around it. And he was also almost certain that if he was not careful, the discovery would be processed and managed and explained in a way that left him as a footnote, a name on an initial report, erased by everything that came after. He was 43 years old. He had worked 19 years for a salary that barely covered his truck payments and the maintenance on a small house in a town 2 hours from anywhere. He had given those 19 years without resentment, because he believed in the work, believed in the land, believed that the mountains deserved someone paying attention to them. He was not about to let the thing he had found become someone else's story. He opened his field notebook to a fresh page and began to write. The week that followed moved in 2 speeds simultaneously. Officially, things crawled. The Heritage Office issued a formal status assessment noting that the site required further evaluation before any access could be granted. The Cultural Ministry issued a parallel statement noting that jurisdictional questions were being resolved. A perimeter had been established around the outer door, marked with survey tape that fluttered in the mountain wind, like something trying to seem more substantial than it was. Nothing was opened. No one went inside. Unofficially, Daniel was contacted 4 times by people who identified themselves with vague institutional affiliations and asked carefully angled questions about what he had seen, what he had touched, whether he had taken anything from the site. The last 2 of these calls came from numbers he did not recognize, and both callers grew noticeably less pleasant when he declined to give detailed answers. He logged each call in his personal notebook. Name when given, number, time, the precise wording of each question. Miriam, the Heritage Office archaeologist, called him on the 5th day. She was not supposed to. He understood that from the way she spoke, clipped, and economical. She told him that the mortar sample she had taken had been analyzed. The composition placed its manufacture between 1840 and 1870 with high confidence. The stone cutting inside the passage showed tool marks consistent with instruments in use in that period. The site was almost certainly mid-19th century. Then she told him something else. The lock on the inner door had been examined by a specialist. It was a proprietary mechanism, the kind manufactured by a German company that had operated briefly during the 1850s and 1860s, primarily supplying institutions in South America through trade routes that passed through the colonial port cities. The same company had manufactured locks for 3 institutions in the region, a bank in the lowland capital, a government treasury office that no longer existed, and a diocese. Daniel said nothing for a moment. The diocese, he said finally. Yes, she said. And then she ended the call. He sat with that for a long time. The ecclesiastical archive document he had found online came back to him, the reference to a repository established by the diocese in the years of uncertainty. He pulled up the digitized excerpt again and read it for the 4th time. A place of safekeeping. He thought about what a diocese in the mid-19th century, facing political upheaval and the instability of a region in transition, would have considered worth safekeeping. He thought about the scope of institutional wealth that moved through the church during that period, not just money, but objects of religious and historical significance, artwork, manuscripts, relics, land records, documents that established ownership and legitimacy. He thought about the lock. Proprietary. Expensive. The kind that communicated not just security, but permanence. Whoever installed it was not planning to come back next month. They were planning for a timeline measured in decades, or longer. And then the thought that had been circling the edge of his mind since the moment he first saw the door fully formed and landed. No one had come back. Not in over 170 years. Whatever was in there had been sealed away during a period of profound instability and never retrieved. The people who put it there had either died, fled, lost the means to return, or been prevented from doing so by circumstances that had swept them out of history along with everything else from that period. He called Esperanza again that night. She answered on the 2nd ring, which told him she had been waiting. He told her about the lock, about the diocese, about the archive document. He could hear her breathing change as he spoke, the quality of attention shifting. When he finished, she was quiet for what felt like a long time. Daniel, she said finally, I need to tell you something about the people who have been making inquiries about this site at the ministry level. He listened. There is a family, she said. Old money, old name. They have been making claims about property in that mountain range for 30 years. The claims have been contested and unresolved because there's never been enough documentary evidence to settle them either way. If what's behind that door contains what I think it might, those claims become either irrelevant or extremely relevant, depending on what the documents show. Whose family? He asked. She gave him a name. He wrote it down in his field notebook with the same care he gave everything else. That name appeared in the historical record he had been reading. Not prominently, not in any headline or official history, but in the margins of things, in the footnotes of accounts of the transition period, in the kinds of references that only surfaced if you were specifically looking for them. It was the name of a family that had been close to the diocese during the mid-19th century, a family that had, by several accounts, provided logistical support for the preservation of church assets during the years of political upheaval, a family that would have known, or might have known, what was put in that mountain. Daniel closed his notebook and looked out the window of the outpost at the dark ridge line. The stars over the high country were extraordinary on clear nights, the altitude and the distance from any city stripping away everything that usually dimmed them. He thought about the door he had opened, about the cold air that had come out of it like something finally allowed to breathe, about the date scratched into the mortar. He thought about the people now moving around the edges of his discovery, positioning themselves before anything was even confirmed. He thought about what it meant to find something that other people had been looking for, or trying to prevent from being found, for a very long time. And he thought about his father, who had worked the same mountain range as a laborer for a mining survey operation when Daniel was 7 years old, and who had come home one evening talking about finding something carved into a cliff face that the survey team had been told to not include in the official record. His father had been a man who followed instructions. He had not included it. He had spent the rest of his life occasionally mentioning it at the kitchen table, the something he had seen and kept quiet about, never knowing what it was or whether the silence had mattered. Daniel had become a ranger partly because of that story, because he wanted to be the kind of person who looked at the things the official record was trained to overlook. He had found something the official record had overlooked for 170 years. He was not going to keep quiet about it. The next morning, he submitted a formal request, through proper channels, for independent archaeological assessment of the site. He cited the heritage protection statutes, which he had spent 2 evenings reading carefully. He copied Esperanza and 3 other officials at the Heritage Authority. He worded it in the dry, precise language of procedure that was impossible to dismiss without explicitly violating the rules everyone was supposed to be following. Osvaldo called him within the hour. "You're making this complicated," Osvaldo said. "It's already complicated," Daniel replied. "I'm just making sure it's complicated in the open." There was a pause. "That family I told you about," Osvaldo said, and his voice had shifted into something careful and tired. "They've been in contact with the ministry. They've retained legal representation. They're claiming that whatever is in that cliff belongs to them by hereditary right." Daniel thought about that. "Do they have documents to support the claim?" "That's what everyone is waiting to find out," Osvaldo said. "And that's why what's in that cliff matters so much to so many people all at once." Daniel understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical, what was actually happening. The door he had found was not just a door. It was a hinge. And on one side of it was a version of history that certain people had been living with comfortably for a very long time. And on the other side was whatever was actually true. And those two things might not be the same thing at all. His formal request generated a response within 4 days, which was fast by bureaucratic standards, and told him his formal request had been taken seriously by someone with enough weight to accelerate the timeline. An independent assessment team would be dispatched. The composition of the team was still being determined. While he waited, Daniel went back to the ridge on his own time. He did not go inside. He simply sat near the outer door, as he had sat near many places in 19 years of ranging, and paid attention. The cliff face above the door had a faint discoloration, a long dark stain running vertically from a point about 20 feet up, where a narrow crack in the limestone allowed water to seep through during the snowmelt season. The stain was old, predating any living memory of the site. It had been there when the door was built, which meant the builders had known about it, had factored it into their planning. They had built around it, using the water-stained section to break up the visual uniformity of the rock face, making the area look more naturally varied, and therefore less likely to attract the kind of scrutiny that found anomalies. It was a deliberate choice. It spoke of people who had thought carefully about concealment over time, not just for a few years, but for generations. He sat there for 2 hours, thinking. The hawk was back, or a different hawk, working the thermal currents above the open slope. He thought about what Miriam had said. Sophisticated. Someone with resources. And then what Esperanza had told him. Documentary evidence to settle claims. If the door had been built with that level of care and intention, then what lay behind it was not simply hidden. It was preserved. Protected across a span of time so long that the people who built it could not have imagined the world in which it would finally be opened. They had built it for people they would never meet, for a future they could only hope would come. Daniel thought about his father's silence, about the things that disappeared into the official record and were never heard from again. He thought about the carved date in the mortar and the cold air that had come out when he pulled the door open. He was going to make sure this was heard. He pulled out his personal field notebook and kept writing. The independent assessment team arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Daniel's formal request. There were 5 of them. 2 archaeologists from a state university, 1 geologist, 1 specialist in historical documents and material culture from the colonial period, and Miriam, who had come back in a capacity that was now officially attached to the Heritage Authority rather than the ministry. The presence of all 5 of them, assembled with that particular combination of expertise, told Daniel something important. Someone in the Heritage Authority had read his reports and understood what they were looking at. The team lead was a woman named Dra. Inés Castellano, an archaeologist in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the specific economy of movement that came from a career spent working in tight spaces with fragile materials. She shook Daniel's hand on the trailhead and spent the first minute asking him questions about the site, not about the contents or the significance, but about the condition of the path, the stability of the ground near the entrance, whether he had observed any changes since his initial discovery. He answered everything precisely. She listened without taking notes, which told him she was the kind of person who remembered. The walk to the ridge took 40 minutes. The team moved with a focused efficiency that Daniel recognized as genuine expertise, each person carrying exactly what they needed and nothing more. No one spoke unnecessarily. The mountain absorbed them without protest. When Dr. Castellano saw the outer door, she crouched in front of it for a long time before she said anything. She looked at the hinges, the frame, the way the wood had settled against the stone, the thin line of shadow along the bottom edge where the door met the ground. Then she looked at the cliff face above it, tracing the long, dark stain with her gaze. The builders knew this water run existed, she said. Yes, Daniel agreed. I had the same thought. She glanced at him sideways. He had the sudden impression that she had been told he was merely the reporting ranger, the person who walked past things and noted them down, and that his observation had surprised her. What else have you noticed? She asked. He told her. The tool marks on the passage floor, the precision of the built wall, the style of the lock, the composition of the mortar and what it implied about the timeline, the carved inscription with the date. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once, slowly. You've been doing your homework, she said. 19 years of field work, he replied. You learned to read what's in front of you. She nodded again and stood, brushing dust from her knees. Good. I'd rather have someone like you on site than someone who just marks the GPS coordinates and waits for instructions. The team spent the rest of the morning documenting the entrance and the passage before anyone moved toward the inner chamber. This was the right way to do it, and Daniel watched the process with a respect that was partly professional and partly something more personal. He had spent enough time around sites that had been damaged by impatience to understand that the discipline of not rushing was where most of the real knowledge lived. By afternoon, when the team gathered in the outer chamber in front of the built wall and the inner door, the quality of attention in the room had shifted. Not louder or more excited, but denser, heavier. The door itself seemed to fill more space than its physical dimensions warranted. The document specialist, a small quiet man named Tomas who had said almost nothing all day, crouched beside the lock mechanism and examined it for a long time with a powerful magnifying glass. Then he sat back and said, in a voice that was almost conversational, that the lock was made by a firm called Eisenwald and Sohn, which had operated out of Hamburg between 1849 and 1871. He knew this because the maker's mark, almost invisible beneath a century and a half of grime, was stamped into the underside of the lock housing. Miriam caught Daniel's eye from across the chamber. He gave her a small nod. The diocese connection, the German mechanism, the 19th century timeline. It was all aligning. Dr. Castellano made the decision to leave the inner door sealed until a proper opening protocol could be established. This was the correct and responsible choice and also, Daniel suspected, the politically necessary one. Any breach of the inner chamber that could not be definitively documented as conducted under formal heritage authority supervision would invite legal challenges from anyone with a claim to what lay inside. By doing it correctly the first time, they made it harder to argue with. He had been thinking along those lines himself. He approved. The team came back the following Tuesday with additional equipment, better lighting, a video recording system, and a locksmith specializing in historical mechanisms, an elderly man from the capital named Senor Fuentes, no relation to Osvaldo, who had worked on more 19th century locks than he could accurately count, and who treated the Eisenwald mechanism with the kind of reverence that Daniel associated with people who had devoted their professional lives to understanding a single narrow thing extremely well. Senor Fuentes spent 4 hours with the lock. He did not hurry. He made no comment about the pressure everyone in the chamber was pretending not to feel. He worked with instruments Daniel could not identify and moved with a patience that was almost meditative. When the lock finally gave, there was no dramatic sound, no grinding of metal or groan of old hinges. Just a soft, clean click, and then Senor Fuentes looked up and nodded once. Daniel was standing at the back of the group. He had positioned himself there deliberately, understanding that the space needed to belong to the specialists. He was the one who had found the door. He did not need to be the one who stood closest to the opening of it. That distinction was clear in his mind, and he was at peace with it. Dr. Castellano pushed the door inward. She did it slowly, using both hands, letting the hinges move at their own pace, not forcing anything. The door swung open into a darkness that the lighting equipment, positioned around the chamber, tried its best to fill. The silence that came out was different from the silence of the outer passage. Denser, older, the kind of silence that had accumulated over so many years it had become a physical substance. Everyone waited. No one went in immediately. That was also the right instinct. Dr. Castellano activated a handheld air quality monitor and held it through the door. The readout showed nothing concerning. She waited another 2 minutes. Then she stepped inside. The rest of the team followed one by one. Daniel came last. What he saw in the beam of the lighting equipment stopped him just inside the threshold. The inner chamber was large. Not cathedral large, but larger than anything that the exterior dimensions of the cliff should have permitted, which meant the natural geology had been used deliberately, a cavity or a fault in the rock that the original builders had identified and expanded, then sealed. The ceiling was uneven stone, following the natural contours of the formation. The walls were partly natural and partly dressed, smoothed in sections where the rock had been too irregular to leave as is. The floor was stone-laid, each piece cut to fit, the joints so tight that after a century and a half, they showed almost no settling. And along the walls, arranged with a care that was almost ceremonial, were things. Objects of different sizes wrapped in materials that had survived through a combination of the sealed environment, the stable temperature, and the quality of the wrapping itself. Some were covered in oilcloth, dried and stiff, but intact. Some were boxed in wooden cases that had kept their shape. Some were stacked in orderly rows on stone shelves that had been cut directly into the chamber walls. Tomas, the document specialist, made a sound that Daniel had never heard from a man of his caliber. Something between a gasp and a word that he swallowed before it could fully form. He moved to the nearest shelf, bent close, and peered at the closest package without touching it. After a moment, he straightened and looked at Dr. Castellano. "These are documents," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "There are documents here. A great many of them." Dr. Castellano nodded. Her own expression had gone very still, the way faces do when emotion is being held under pressure. "What else?" she said. Tomas moved along the wall, bending and looking, never touching. He stopped at one of the wooden cases and examined it from multiple angles. "Artwork," he said, "or what appears to be artwork. The cases are the right size, and they're built to minimize movement inside. The construction suggests they knew the contents were fragile and irreplaceable." Daniel stood near the entrance and watched. He was trying to hold on to the specific texture of the moment, the weight of the cold air, the sound of careful footsteps on old stone, the quality of light from the equipment, the controlled breathing of a group of professional people confronting something none of them had ever encountered at this scale. The geologist was examining the chamber walls, recording observations about the rock formation, the extent of the natural cavity versus the artificially cut sections. He worked quietly at the edges while the others concentrated on the contents. One corner of the chamber held something different. Not objects wrapped and boxed for preservation, but a piece of furniture. A writing desk, small and plain, the kind that could be carried by 2 people. It was still upright, its surface dusty but intact. On its surface, weighed down by a round river stone, was a leather-bound book. The leather had dried to the texture of old bark, but it had not cracked or warped. The sealed environment had held. Tomas moved to the desk and stood over the book for a long time, studying it without touching it, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he said, in a voice meant only for Dr. Castellano, that it appeared to be a registry of some kind. He could see text through the front cover, the impression of writing on the first pages visible through the dried leather in the way that old documents sometimes retained the ghost of their contents on the outside. "A registry of what?" Dr. Castellano said. "Of what's here," Tomas replied. "A record of everything brought into this chamber and why." The room was very quiet. Daniel thought about the family Esperanza had named, about the 30 years of unresolved claims, about the people who had been making calls and retaining legal counsel and deploying phrases like media management. He thought about whatever was written in that registry and what it would mean for every competing version of history that had been built on the assumption that this chamber would never be opened. He thought about the people who had put these things here in 1847, carrying objects wrapped in oilcloth through an autumn that must have been tense and frightened and uncertain, believing they were protecting something for a future they hoped would come. They could not have imagined the future that had actually arrived. He thought about his father's silence and the thing his father had found and been told to ignore and had ignored for the rest of his life. He thought about the carved date in the mortar and the cold air and the sound of the lock releasing. He stood in the doorway of the chamber and looked at what one morning's walk had led to, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that paying attention had mattered. The documentation phase began immediately. Every object, every case, every wrapped package would be cataloged before anything was moved or opened. This would take days, possibly weeks. The site was now secured around the clock, which required logistical arrangements Daniel helped coordinate since he knew the terrain better than anyone else on the team. He was given an official role, site liaison. It came with paperwork and a temporary commission from the Heritage Authority and a formal set of duties that looked modest on paper but placed him at the center of everything that happened at the ridge. Osvaldo had pushed for it, he learned later. Osvaldo, whatever his other qualities, understood that the man who found a thing and had the discipline to report it correctly deserved more than a footnote. Daniel accepted the role with the same quiet that characterized most of his responses to things. He thanked Osvaldo. He read the paperwork. He showed up the next morning at the ridge before anyone else and stood at the entrance to the outer passage while the mountain turned gold in the early light, thinking about everything and nothing at all. The hawk appeared again, circling high over the open slope. He watched it for a while, then turned and went inside to begin the work. Over the days that followed, as the cataloging proceeded and the scale of what lay inside the chamber became clearer, the pressure from outside the mountain increased in direct proportion. The family whose name Esperanza had given him retained a second legal team. Government officials made inquiries at levels that Osvaldo described to Daniel as uncomfortably elevated. A regional newspaper ran a story based on unattributed sources, describing the find in vague terms that nonetheless made clear someone with access to preliminary information had been talking. Daniel read the article twice. It described the discovery as a potential archaeological site of unclear cultural significance. The phrase unclear cultural significance had clearly been inserted by someone with an interest in managing early perceptions. Clear cultural significance would have generated a different kind of attention. Unclear was a word designed to buy time. He discussed it with Dr. Castellano over coffee in the temporary field station they had set up near the trailhead. Someone is trying to keep this quiet until they can determine how it affects their position, she said. Yes, Daniel agreed. So we don't give them time to do that. She looked at him steadily. You've been thinking about this, she said. About how to move. He had been thinking about it since the morning he found the door. Since before that, even. Since the years of watching things disappear into the official record and never emerge again. The registry, he said. Tomas said it's a record of everything in that chamber and why it's there. If it shows what I think it might show, then the history it documents doesn't belong to any single family or institution or political interest. It belongs to the record. And if it becomes public, Dr. Castellano said, completing his thought, it becomes very difficult to suppress. He nodded. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. I have a contact at the national press, she said. Someone I trust to be accurate and careful. I've been waiting to see whether the official channels would handle this responsibly. And she looked at him. They haven't given me sufficient confidence that they will, she said. The decision was made between the two of them in that small field station, without drama and without ceremony. Not because they wanted to circumvent the proper authorities, but because they had spent enough of their respective careers watching the proper authorities choose convenience over truth to understand that the truth sometimes required a more deliberate kind of help. Daniel went back to the ridge and wrote a careful, detailed account of everything he had observed and documented since the morning of the discovery. Not a formal report, not filtered through institutional language. A plain account, in his own words, of what the chamber contained and why it mattered. He included the lock maker's mark, the date in the mortar, the registry on the desk, the scope of the contents as understood from the cataloging conducted so far. He included the name of the family that was filing legal claims and a description of the official communications that had used the phrase media management. He gave a copy to Dr. Castellano and kept one in his field notebook. And then they waited, because the next part of the story was not theirs to control. It would be driven by what was actually in the registry, by what the documents and the artwork and the other objects in that chamber turned out to be, by what the history they represented actually said. But Daniel had learned, in 19 years of working a landscape that most people never visited, that the land eventually gave up what it was holding. It always did. The question was never whether the truth would surface. The question was only who would be ready when it did. He walked out to the ridge one last time before the day ended. The last of the light was on the cliff face, warm and low, throwing the faint outline of the outer door into relief. From a certain angle, you could see it clearly now that you knew it was there. From any other angle, it was just rock. He stood there until the light faded and the stars came out. And he thought about his father, and he thought about the people who had carried things wrapped in oilcloth through an autumn in 1847. And he thought about all the years between that moment and this one, all the seasons the mountain had kept it secret. Then he turned and walked back down the trail in the dark, his headlamp cutting a steady path through the trees, his field notebook in his jacket pocket, heavy with everything that had already been written and everything that was still to come. What he did not know yet, could not have known, was that the registry on the writing desk would prove to be the most significant single document recovered from the chamber. Not because of its age, not because of its condition, but because of what was recorded inside it in careful, deliberate handwriting that had waited 176 years for someone with the right set of questions to finally read it. He did not know that the name in the registry would match a name in a land deed that had been disputed for 30 years, and that the matching would be unambiguous, the kind of clarity that left no room for competing interpretation. He did not know that 3 of the artwork cases would contain pieces that had been listed as lost or destroyed in the chaos of the mid-19th century, pieces that scholars had argued about and mourned for generations. He did not know that one of the document bundles wrapped in oilcloth contained original correspondence between the diocese and a government official from 1848, correspondence that detailed exactly how and why those assets had been moved to the mountain and who had authorized it, and under what terms they were to be held in trust. He did not know any of it yet, but he had found the door, and he had opened it, and he had written everything down, and that was enough for now. The rest would come when it came, carried forward by the weight of what was true. He walked back to the outpost in the dark and made himself a meal and sat at the table in the kitchen. And for the first time in 9 years, he did not feel like a man who had spent his working life being overlooked. He felt, for no reason he could have fully explained, exactly like the person he had always been trying to become. The registry was opened on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the inner chamber had first been unsealed. Dr. Castellano had insisted on the delay, not out of caution, exactly, though caution was part of it. The registry required a specific environment to be safely examined, and creating that environment inside a mountain chamber was not a simple matter of bringing in better lighting. A portable humidity-controlled workspace had to be assembled at the field station. Tomas, the document specialist, had requested 3 particular tools from the National Archive facility that took a week to arrive. The process had to be filmed in its entirety by 2 separate cameras, one operated by a Heritage Authority technician and one by Marcus, a videographer Dr. Castellano had brought on specifically because she trusted his discretion. All of this was proper and right, and Daniel did not question any of it. But the 11 days had not been quiet ones. The legal pressure from the family whose name Esperanza had given him had escalated in ways that were difficult to track precisely, because it moved through channels that were not public-facing. Daniel knew about it only through Osvaldo, who briefed him every second day in phone calls that grew progressively shorter as Osvaldo was increasingly careful about what he said on record. The family had filed 2 injunctions, both rejected on procedural grounds, but both intended, in the way that legal actions sometimes are, more to generate delay and uncertainty than to win outright. A second newspaper story appeared, this one in the Capital Press, suggesting that the site might be connected to assets looted during a period of political violence in the mid-19th century. The framing was careful enough to avoid direct accusation, but the implication was clear. Someone was trying to establish a narrative in advance of the facts, placing the chamber and its contents inside a story about theft and illegitimacy before anyone knew what the contents actually showed. Daniel read that article with a controlled anger that he recognized as useful. Anger of that particular temperature, the kind that did not cloud thinking but sharpened it, was something he had learned to treat as a resource. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He wrote a careful rebuttal in his personal notes, fact by fact, addressing every unsupported claim in the article with what was actually documented. He did not publish the rebuttal. He kept it in his notebook because the moment to use it had not yet arrived. The morning of the registry opening, he arrived at the field station before dawn. The portable workspace was already lit, its climate controls humming softly in the early quiet. Tomas was there ahead of him, seated at a work table, reviewing his notes with the focused calm of someone who had prepared for this many times and was now simply allowing the preparation to meet the moment. They nodded at each other. No conversation was necessary. Dr. Castellano arrived at first light, followed by Marcus with his camera, and then by a woman Daniel had not met before, introduced simply as Gabriella, a specialist in 19th-century ecclesiastical records who had been flown in from the National Archive 2 days earlier. Gabriella was in her late 40s, with the slightly distracted quality of someone whose attention was almost always partially elsewhere, tracking something in her mind that the visible world was a pale translation of. She looked at the registry on its transport tray, still closed, still covered in dried leather that had waited a century and 3/4 for this morning, and she pressed her lips together as if preventing herself from saying something she would rather feel than speak. The camera recorded everything. Tomas worked with the careful deliberateness that characterized all his movements, using a fine brush to clear the surface of the registry before any handling began, documenting the condition of the cover, the binding, the visible edge of the pages through a series of close photographs taken at multiple angles. Then he looked at Dr. Castellano, who nodded once. He opened it. The leather cover moved with a resistance that was not quite stiffness, more like the resistance of something that had been very still for a very long time and needed a moment to remember how motion worked. The binding held. The pages, as the first ones came into view, were intact, their surface a deep cream color darkened slightly at the edges, the ink brown where it had once been black, but still sharp enough to read without enhancement. The handwriting was small and precise and consistent throughout. The hand of someone who had written a great deal and knew how to make letters that would last. Tomas leaned close with his magnifying loupe. He read in silence for a full 2 minutes. Then he straightened and looked at Gabriella. She had already been reading over his shoulder. Her face was very still. "What does it say?" Dr. Castellano asked. Gabriella straightened too. She clasped her hands in front of her and spoke in a measured voice that Daniel suspected cost her some effort to keep at that register. "It is a registry of contents," she said. "Exactly as it appears to be. Each item brought into this chamber is listed, the date of its placement, its description, its provenance, and the authority under which it was placed here." She paused. "The authority is the Diocese of the Western Sierra," she continued, "acting under emergency powers granted by the bishop in October of 1847, following political developments that the author describes as threatening the permanent loss of assets held in trust for the public good. That is a direct translation of the phrase used. The room was very quiet. Daniel thought about the phrase. Assets held in trust for the public good. Not for the church. Not for the bishop or the diocese as an institution. For the public good. "Who signed it?" he asked. Gabriella looked at him. "The registry is signed and witnessed by 3 parties, she said. The diocese administrator, a civil notary whose seal is still legible on the final page, and a lay trustee." She paused again. "The lay trustee is identified by name and by role. His role is described as representative of the associated families who participated in the preservation effort. And the name," Dr. Castellano said. Gabriella gave it. The name was not the one Esperanza had told Daniel to watch for. It was different. A different family entirely. One that did not appear in the 30 years of legal filings, or the recent newspaper articles, or any of the communications he had logged in his field notebook. The silence in the room changed quality. "I need to understand what that means," Dr. Castellano said carefully. Gabriella unclasped her hands and then clasped them again. "It means," she said, "that the family currently filing legal claims based on hereditary rights to this chamber and its contents is not the family identified in the registry as a party to the original preservation agreement. It also means that the registry itself constitutes documentary evidence of who was authorized to act in connection with these assets and under what terms. Daniel thought about the 30 years of legal filings, about the expensive lawyers and the injunctions and the newspaper articles placed in advance to shape the narrative, about the officials who had spoken of media management as if the truth were a problem to be managed rather than a fact to be reported. He thought about 1847 and the people who had carried things wrapped in oilcloth through the mountain autumn, and how none of them could have imagined that what they left behind would still be contested, still fought over, still the subject of someone else's ambition 176 years later. Then he thought about the registry and its precise language. Assets held in trust for the public good. The people who wrote that sentence had understood exactly what they were doing and why. They had not sealed this chamber for a family. They had sealed it for everyone. He excused himself from the field station and walked out into the morning air. The pine trees around the trailhead were full of light, the sun still low enough to hit them at an angle that made the needles glow. He stood there for a few minutes, breathing carefully, the way he had learned to do in 19 years of moments that required steadiness. Then he called Esperanza. She picked up immediately. He told her what Gabriela had found. He read her the name from his notebook, the lay trustee identified in the registry. He described the language of the signing, the three parties, the emergency powers, the phrase about the public good. She was quiet for longer than usual. That name, she said finally. I know it. Not from the legal filings, not from the family currently making claims. From the historical record. He waited. There was a dispute in the 1870s, she said. After the political situation had stabilized enough that the people who had placed things in safekeeping might reasonably have attempted to retrieve them. One family filed a claim with the regional authority at that time, asserting that they alone had the right to access certain preserved assets in the Sierra. The claim was contested by another family, and the dispute was never resolved because neither party could produce sufficient documentation to establish priority. Daniel understood. Because the documentation was in the chamber, he said, which no one could access. Esperanza agreed, because no one knew where it was by that point. Or if they did know, they couldn't prove it without the registry. And the family that eventually stopped pursuing it, he said, is not the family that's currently filing claims today, she said. Yes. The current claimants appear to have derived their position from an interpretation of inheritance that has never been tested against primary documents. Because the primary documents were sealed in a cliff, Daniel said. Yes, Esperanza said. He stood among the pine trees and let the full shape of it settle into him. Someone, at some point in the intervening century and a half, had constructed a claim to this chamber and its contents out of fragments and inference and the absence of contradicting evidence. That claim had been repeated and built upon and invested with the kind of confidence that comes from never being seriously challenged. And it had never been seriously challenged because the chamber that would have challenged it was unknown, sealed behind a wooden door that blended into limestone so well that 19 years of a careful man's surveying had almost missed it. Almost. He went back inside and sat at the edge of the workspace while the team continued working through the registry. Over the next 3 hours, Tomas and Gabriela worked together with the camera recording every page, every entry, every signature and seal. The registry contained 147 entries. Each one described an item, its condition at the time of placement, and its documented origin. The entries were varied. Several dozen pertained to documents, correspondence, land records, ecclesiastical papers, civil notary records from the transition period. 24 described artworks, each identified with enough specificity that cross-referencing with known historical catalogs would be straightforward. 12 entries described objects of material and cultural value, ceremonial items from different periods and traditions, preserved with the kind of care that suggested the people who placed them understood their significance extended beyond any single institution or ownership. And 13 entries described something that made the room go quiet again when Gabriela read them aloud. They described financial instruments, promissory notes, and bearer bonds issued by institutions that had operated in the region during the mid-19th century. Several of these institutions had been absorbed into national banking structures over the subsequent decades. The instruments had been listed in the diocesan accounts as assets at the time of the political emergency, assigned values that were significant by the standards of 1847. Their value by current standards was not something anyone in the room calculated aloud. But the implication moved through the space like a current. Daniel wrote in his field notebook, not everything that was being said, but the shape of it, the weight, the specific quality of the silence after Gabriella finished reading each entry. By early afternoon, the first pass through the registry was complete. Dr. Castellano called a break, and everyone stepped outside. The sky had gone from early morning clarity to a high, thin overcast that softened the light without dimming it. The mountain above them was exactly as it had always been, enormous and indifferent and full of things that had taken the right set of eyes to find. "We need to talk about next steps," Dr. Castellano said. "Not procedurally, strategically." Daniel looked at her. "The injunctions," she said, "are going to be refiled the moment word spreads about what the registry contains. And word is going to spread. It always does. We have perhaps 48 hours before this becomes significantly harder to manage cleanly." "What do you mean by cleanly?" he asked. She meant that the discovery, once caught in a legal and political battle of sufficient intensity, would stop being about what was true and start being about who had the resources and the persistence to outlast the other side. That was not a battle the Heritage Authority was equipped to win on its own. The institution was capable and committed, but it was also slow and underfunded in the ways that government bodies that dealt with the past tended to be. What she was saying, without saying it directly, was that they needed the public on their side before the legal machinery could close around the story and make it inaccessible. "The contact at the national press," Daniel said. She nodded. He thought about it for exactly as long as it needed thinking about, which was not very long. He thought about his father's silence, about the thing noted and then not noted in the official record, about everything that disappeared into institutional channels and emerged, if it emerged at all, as something smaller and quieter and less true than what it had been when it went in. He thought about the phrase assets held in trust for the public good. "Call her," he said. Dr. Castellano took out her phone and walked a short distance away among the pines. Daniel stood where he was and listened to the mountain and waited. The journalist's name was Renata Ochoa. She had been covering cultural heritage and historical claims for the national newspaper for 12 years and had broken several stories in that time that had generated significant political consequences. Dr. Castellano trusted her because she had been accurate and fair in circumstances where accuracy and fairness had required something of her professionally. That was the standard Daniel had come to apply to the question of who to trust with difficult information. Not whether someone was sympathetic or friendly or ideologically aligned, but whether they had demonstrated, under pressure, a commitment to getting things right. Renata arrived at the field station the following morning. She was younger than Daniel had expected, early 30s, with the particular alert quietness of someone who spent a great deal of time listening. She came alone, with a recorder and a notebook, and she spent the first hour simply asking questions and writing down the answers. She asked Daniel about the morning of the discovery, not about the significance of the find, not about the legal disputes or the family's claims. About the morning, what the light was like, what had made him stop, what he had heard when he first touched the door. He answered all of it. He found that describing the ordinary details of that morning, the worn boots, the survey route he had walked dozens of times, the specific quality of the silence that had come out of the opening chamber, made the discovery feel more real rather than less. As if the truth of it lived in those small details more than in any of the larger facts that had accumulated around it. Renata took notes through all of it without interrupting. Then she asked to see the field notebook. He hesitated for a single beat, then handed it over. She spent 40 minutes with it, reading carefully, not skimming. She asked 2 questions. The first was about a specific date he had recorded in relation to one of the calls from the unidentified numbers. The second was about the exact wording of the phrase media management, whether he was certain of it or was paraphrasing. He was certain. He had written it down within minutes of the conversation ending. She nodded and handed the notebook back. Then she asked to see the registry. Tomas and Gabriella walked her through it over 2 hours, with the camera recording and with Dr. Castellano present throughout. Renata asked precise questions about specific entries. She asked about the ecclesiastical authority under which the chamber had been established, about the civil notary seal and what it meant legally, about the financial instruments and how their provenance could be verified. By the time the session was finished, The light outside was beginning its late afternoon shift toward gold. Renata sat with her notebook open on her knee and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel. "Why did you stop?" she said. "That morning on the ridge. Most people would have kept walking." He thought about it honestly. "Because the barn was solid," he said, and then caught himself, because that was not the right metaphor for this story. Because something looked wrong in the right way. 19 years teaches you that when something looks like it was meant to be overlooked, the first question is why. She wrote that down. The story ran 4 days later, on a Sunday, which was when the newspaper's readership was largest. It ran on the front page, above the fold, with a photograph of the outer door that Marcus had taken in the low morning light of the day the Heritage team first arrived, the door looking both humble and momentous in the way that genuine discoveries often did. The headline was straightforward. Daniel appreciated that. No inflation, no reaching for drama that the facts did not require. The facts were dramatic enough on their own. He read the story at the kitchen table in the outpost at 6 in the morning before the phone started ringing. He read it twice, carefully, the way he read everything. Renata had been accurate in every detail he could verify and had been careful about the details he could not verify, noting what was confirmed and what remained under assessment. She had included the phrase from the registry, assets held in trust for the public good, and she had put it where it belonged, at the center of the story rather than at its edges. She had also included the name of the family currently filing legal claims and the name of the family identified in the registry as the actual party to the original preservation agreement. The difference between those two names was not editorialized. It was simply noted. The reader was trusted to understand what the discrepancy meant. The phone started ringing at 6:40. The first call was from Osvaldo, who said, in a tone that was more relieved than anything else, that the ministry had received 17 inquiries from other press outlets before 7 in the morning and was formally requesting that Daniel refer all media contact to the Heritage Authority Communications Office. Daniel said he would do that. He had already said everything he needed to say, and he had said it through the right channel. The second call was from a number he did not recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The message was brief and formal and identified the caller as legal counsel for the family, whose name was in the newspaper article. The message requested that Daniel contact the firm at his earliest convenience to discuss certain matters relating to his official conduct in connection with the site. He saved the message and added the caller's name and number to his field notebook and did not call back. The third call was from his sister in the city, who had seen the story shared on her phone before she got out of bed. She said, in the voice she used when she did not know whether to be proud or worried, that he needed to be careful. He told her he was being careful. He had been careful since the morning on the ridge. He intended to keep being careful. He was not afraid of the legal firm. He was not afraid of the officials who were managing the story from above Osvaldo's level. He was not afraid of the family or their lawyers or the newspaper articles that had been planted to shape perception before the facts arrived. He had the facts. He had written them down, page by page, in a field notebook that he had kept separate from every official channel. And now those facts were in the national newspaper, and they were on the internet, and they were being shared by people who had never heard of the Sierra Madre Occidental or the Diocese of 1847 or the Eisenwald Lock or any of it. People who simply understood, reading a straightforward account of a wooden door found in a cliff face and what lay behind it, that something true had been hidden for a very long time and had finally been allowed to come out. By evening, the story had been picked up by 4 international outlets. One of them was an archaeological publication that had seen the photographs of the registry and contacted Dr. Castellano directly. Another was a cultural heritage organization that issued a statement within hours of the story running, calling for full, independent oversight of the site and its contents. The legal pressure, which had been building for weeks in the channels that most people never saw, did not disappear. But it changed character. It became harder to apply quietly, harder to route through conversations in government offices or briefings that were not recorded, harder to make look like ordinary procedure when the story was now being read by people who would notice if the ordinary procedure produced an outcome that contradicted the documented facts. Daniel had understood this was the mechanism. He had been counting on it, not out of cynicism about the people in the official channels, most of whom he believed were doing their jobs as well as the pressures around them permitted, but because he had learned, in 19 years of working a landscape that most people never visited, that the most effective protection for a true thing was to put it somewhere that many people could see it. That night, he drove to the ridge one more time. He parked at the trailhead and walked up in the dark with his headlamp, not toward the outer door, but to the flat rock where he had sat and waited for the heritage team on the day they first arrived. He sat there now with his back to the cliff and looked out over the forest below, the dark mass of trees under a sky that was cold and clear and absolutely full of stars. He thought about what the chamber contained: the documents and the artwork and the ceremonial objects and the financial instruments, each one wrapped and placed and sealed by people who had believed that protection was possible if you were careful enough and patient enough and built things with enough care to last. They had been right. The protection had held. The care had lasted. And now everything they had preserved was going to be assessed and documented and studied, and, in whatever form was most appropriate, returned to the public trust it had always been meant for. He thought about the registry and its 147 entries, about all the hands that had carried those objects through the mountain autumn in 1847, the people whose names were not in any record that had survived, who had done the labor of preservation without any expectation of recognition. He thought about the document in the ecclesiastical archive that had mentioned a place of safekeeping and nothing else, the fragment that had pointed him here without ever quite pointing anywhere specific. He thought about his father. He sat on the flat rock for an hour, listening to the wind move through the pines and watching the stars turn their slow circle overhead. And he felt the specific satisfaction of a man who had done the thing that needed doing in the way that it needed to be done. Not loudly, not dramatically, without rushing. He had found the door because he had been paying attention. He had opened it because he had been willing to go where the evidence led. He had documented everything because he had understood that truth, once found, required protection of its own. He had protected it. The rest would take time. The legal questions would be resolved through proper process, which would move slowly and would require patience. The contents of the chamber would be assessed and cataloged over months, possibly years, by people with the expertise to do it correctly. The historical record would be revised to include what the registry documented, and that revision would change the way certain things were understood, not dramatically, not all at once, but permanently. None of that would happen quickly, but it would happen because it was already public, already documented, already in the hands of people whose job was to ensure that what was true did not get managed back into the shadows. He stood from the flat rock and stretched his back and looked up at the stars one more time. Then he clicked on his headlamp and walked back down to the trailhead, through the dark pines and the cold mountain air, his boots finding the familiar path without needing to think about it, his field notebook in his jacket pocket, the night around him full of the sounds of things that had always been there, waiting for someone to listen. He did not sleep well that night either, though this time it was not fear or anxiety keeping him awake. It was something closer to the feeling he had experienced the morning on the ridge, that heightened alertness that came when the world was in the middle of changing and you were situated at the point where the change was most concentrated. His mind moved through everything methodically, the way it always did when it was working on a problem it had not yet fully solved. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Because there was still something that was not sitting right. He lay in the dark of the outpost and turned it over carefully. The registry named a lay trustee from a family that was not the family currently filing claims. That much was clear and documented. Renata's story had reported it accurately. The discrepancy was real and its implications were significant. But discrepancies of that kind, in a situation involving assets of that magnitude, did not arise by accident. Someone had constructed the current family's claim from something. There had been a beginning, a moment when a set of assertions had first been assembled into a legal position that could be filed and defended and built upon over 30 years of litigation and near litigation. That beginning had to have a source. He thought about what Esperanza had told him. The dispute in the 1870s, when two families had each filed claims and neither could produce sufficient documentation. The claim that had eventually been abandoned. And then, decades later, a different claim emerging from a different family with no apparent connection to either of the original disputing parties. Where had that claim come from? On what basis had it been built? given that the documentation supporting it could not have existed in any accessible form since the chamber had been sealed. He sat up in bed at 2 in the morning and wrote the question in his field notebook. Not because writing it would answer it, but because writing it precisely was the first step toward finding out. He called Esperanza in the morning, early enough that she was still audible in that particular register people have when they are drinking their first coffee of the day and have not yet fully committed to the demands of the world. He laid out the question for her. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he valued most about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about the gap?" she said. He was thinking about the gap, yes. The gap between the original 1847 sealing of the chamber, the 1870s dispute between two families with some genuine connection to the original events, and the current legal action which had no documented connection to either. "What fills that gap?" he said. She said she did not know, but that she was going to find out. She had a colleague at the National Archive who specialized in the legal records of the post-independence period. The kind of person who had spent decades reading documents that most historians considered too granular to be worth examining. The kind of person who noticed things in footnotes. He spent the rest of that day at the field station, where the cataloging of the chamber's contents continued under Dr. Castellano's supervision. The process was meticulous and slow, each item handled by gloved hands, each description entered into a digital database that was cross-referenced with historical catalogs and records. It would take months to process everything fully, but even the preliminary inventory, which was already substantial, was enough to confirm what the registry had suggested. The chamber contained things of enormous cultural and historical significance. Not wealth in any simple sense, though the financial instruments had their own weight. The significance was of a different kind. Many of the documents represented the only surviving records of transactions and decisions and agreements made during a period of profound political turbulence, a period from which the documentary record was incomplete in ways that had shaped historical understanding for over a century. What was in this chamber had the potential to answer questions that scholars had argued over for generations, not by providing new facts exactly, but by providing documentation for facts that had been known imperfectly or inferred without proof. Raphael, the young archaeologist who had been among the first heritage team members to arrive, spent an afternoon sitting with Daniel outside the field station while they waited for a supply delivery. He was the kind of person who processed things verbally, and Daniel had learned to be a good audience for people like that, partly because listening cost him little and partly because it sometimes produced useful observations. "You know what the thing about this is," Raphael said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Daniel waited. Everyone assumed it was gone. All the scholars who knew there were gaps in the record from that period. They had constructed theories and working hypotheses and entire interpretive frameworks based on the assumption that the missing documentation was missing because it was destroyed. That's what happens during political upheaval. Records burn. Archives are looted. Things are scattered and lost. That's the normal pattern, and it's a reasonable assumption. Daniel nodded. But this didn't follow the normal pattern, Raphael continued. The people responsible for these materials in 1847 were ahead of the assumption. They understood that people in the future would assume the records were gone, because that's what happened to most records from periods like that one. And they built the chamber knowing that assumption would protect it, because no one searches for something they believe no longer exists. Daniel thought about that. They used the assumption as concealment, he said. Exactly, Raphael said. The best hiding place for something valuable is somewhere no one thinks to look. And no one thinks to look for records that are assumed to have been destroyed. The chamber was hidden not just physically, but conceptually. Daniel let that settle into him. He thought about the carved date and the Eisenwald lock and the careful mortar and the water stain used to break up the visual uniformity of the cliff. He thought about the deliberateness of all of it, the way everything about the site communicated intention. These were not people who had panicked and shoved things in a hole. They were people who had thought carefully about what protection meant across time and had built something accordingly. They had thought about people like him, about the person who would eventually find the door and what that person would need in order to understand what they had found. The registry was not just an inventory. It was a guide, a document designed to be readable by someone who arrived 170 years later with no context beyond what the physical evidence provided. It was, he thought, an act of extraordinary faith. not in any institution or government or legal system, because they had clearly understood that all of those could fail. Faith in the idea that someone would come eventually who was paying enough attention to find what they had left. He was moved by that in a way he did not express to Raphael, but that stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. Esperanza called him 2 days later. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who has found something they were not certain they would find. Her colleague at the National Archive had located a notarial record from 1891, she said. A document generated in the context of a property dispute that had nothing directly to do with the Sierra Chamber, but which referenced, in a footnote, an inheritance claim that had been filed by a family that was the predecessor of the family currently pursuing the legal action. Daniel sat very still. The footnote, Esperanza continued, described the basis of the claim. It was asserted that the family held a document, an internal family letter from the mid-19th century, in which an ancestor claimed to have been involved in the preservation effort of 1847. He understood immediately. The ancestor's claim in the family letter was personal, he said, not documented through the official process, not registered with the notary or the diocese. Just an assertion in a private letter that someone in the family had been part of what happened. Yes, Esperanza said. And over generations, that private assertion, repeated and built upon and eventually formalized into a legal claim, became the basis for 30 years of litigation. The difference between the family in the registry and the family in the claim, he said, was the difference between documented fact and inherited story. Yes, he sat with that for a long time. It was not a simple story about deception. He understood that. The original ancestor had possibly even told the truth about being involved. The word involved covered a great deal of ground. Carrying boxes, providing horses, knowing someone who knew someone. Any of those things might have been true and might have generated a genuine sense of connection to the event, which had then been passed down through generations with the normal accretion of elaboration and emphasis that personal family histories always accumulated. At some point, involvement had become claim. Participation had become ownership. Story had become law. And it had remained unchallenged for so long because the documents that would have challenged it were sealed in a cliff that no one knew was there. He wrote all of this in his field notebook. Then he called Renata. She was interested. She was very interested. She asked him to send her the details Esperanza had provided, and she would follow up directly with the archive colleague. He said he would pass along the request to Esperanza, which he did immediately. Within a week, Renata had a second story. This one was longer and more complex than the first, threading together the 1891 notarial footnote, the history of the legal claim, the family letter that had been the original basis for the assertion, and the contrast between all of that and the registry's clear documentation of who had actually been authorized to act in connection with the preservation effort. It was a careful story. It did not call anyone a liar. It simply laid out the documentary record, which was now considerably more complete than it had been 2 weeks earlier, and let the reader understand what it showed. The second story generated more response than the first, not because it was more dramatic, though it was certainly more complex, but because it addressed something that people recognized from their own lives. The way stories passed down through families could carry genuine feeling and genuine belief, while also being, at their core, something other than what the documents showed. It was a human story inside a historical one. People responded to it with recognition. The legal pressure did not evaporate. Legal pressure in situations involving assets of that magnitude and a claim with 30 years of filings behind it did not simply vanish because a newspaper had published 2 stories based on primary documents. But it shifted again, in the way it had shifted after the first story, from pressure applied in private channels to a position that had to be defended in public. Defending a position in public, when the documentary record did not support it, was a different kind of challenge than filing injunctions through channels that most people never saw. The lawyers could still file. The motions could still be generated. But the framing of the dispute had changed, and changing the framing of a dispute changed what outcomes were available. Osvaldo told Daniel during one of their phone calls that the ministry had received a communication from the family's legal team indicating a willingness to intermediation regarding the heritage status of the site. The phrasing of the communication, Osvaldo said, was notably different from the phrasing of all previous communications, which had asserted ownership rather than requested process. It was not a concession. It was a retreat toward a position that might eventually reach something resembling resolution. That was different from concession, but it was also different from the situation a month ago, when the claim had been advanced with the confidence of something that had never been seriously tested. Daniel noted the shift in his field notebook without celebration. Things moved slowly in situations like this. He had known that from the beginning and had planned accordingly. What he had not planned for, because there was no way to have anticipated it, was the message he received from a university in another country. It came through the Heritage Authority, forwarded by Osvaldo with a note that said simply, "Thought you should see this." The message was from a historian named Dr. Luisa Ferreira, who worked at a research institute that specialized in the cultural history of the Ibero-American colonial period. She had read Renata's articles. She had then, being the kind of person she was, gone to the primary sources, pulling up the digitized fragments of the ecclesiastical archive that had been available online for years and cross-referencing them with what the articles described. She had found something. In a collection of letters from the 1850s, written by the diocese administrator of the Western Sierra to a colleague in another city, there was a reference to the preservation effort of 1847. The letter described the effort in general terms, noting that the bishop had acted out of concern for the integrity of certain assets during a period of instability. But it also mentioned, in passing, that the lay trustee who had provided assistance had done so at personal risk, traveling through territory that was not safe, and that the diocese had documented its gratitude in a way that, Dr. Ferreira wrote, the language suggested was formal and official and not merely private. The documentation of gratitude, an official record of the lay trustee's role, generated by the diocese itself, separate from the registry in the chamber. Dr. Ferreira asked whether anyone had searched the diocesan archive for that record. The diocesan archive was not in the same city as the National Archive. It was maintained by the church in a building that had been rebuilt twice since the 1850s and whose holdings had been partially cataloged in the 1970s, but not fully digitized. It was the kind of archive that required physical presence, patience, and the kind of reading knowledge that most researchers did not have time to develop. Dr. Ferreira had all three. She offered to make the trip. Dr. Castellano handled the coordination. Daniel observed from the edges, understanding that his role in this phase of the discovery was to be a reliable anchor of the original documented facts rather than to extend in every new direction the story was opening into. He had found the door. He had opened it. He had written everything down. The subsequent discoveries, the layers of documentation emerging from archives and footnotes and letters, were the consequence of that initial act of attention. They belonged to the people who were following each thread wherever it led. He was content with that. More than content, there was a specific satisfaction in having started something that was now larger than him, that had taken on its own momentum and would continue regardless of what any single individual did or failed to do. Dr. Ferreira spent 3 days in the diocesan archive. On the second day, she found what the 1850s letter had implied existed. It was a formal letter of recognition, written on official diocesan letterhead, signed by the bishop himself. It named the lay trustee, described his role in the 1847 preservation effort in specific terms, and noted that his participation had been authorized by and conducted in direct cooperation with the diocesan administrator and the civil notary whose seal appeared in the registry. The letter also named, as witnesses to the trustee's role, 2 other individuals. Neither of them was connected in any traceable way to the family currently filing legal claims. Dr. Ferreira photographed the letter and sent the photographs to Dr. Castellano within the hour. Dr. Castellano forwarded them to Tomas and Gabriela for assessment. Their assessment came back within 24 hours. The document was consistent with the period, the letterhead matched known examples. The signature was verifiable against other signed letters from the same bishop held in the same archive. It was authentic. The story Renata wrote about the bishop's letter ran the following Sunday, for the 3rd time on the front page above the fold. This one she had more time to prepare, and it showed. She had reached out to the family's legal team for comment before publication. Their response, included in the article as a quoted statement, was brief and notably less assertive than their previous public communications. They said the family was reviewing the newly available historical documentation and would provide a more detailed response in due course. Daniel read that sentence 4 times. He knew what reviewing newly available historical documentation meant when it appeared in a statement from a legal team that had spent 30 years asserting a position with confidence. It meant that the position was no longer supportable, and that the legal team was in the process of determining how to manage a retreat that preserved as much face as possible. It would take time. Everything in this situation took time. But the direction of travel was now clear. He sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper on the screen of his phone and his coffee going cold beside him and thought about the morning on the ridge, the particular angle of the light, the worn toe of his left boot, the way the cliff face had caught his attention in the way that things caught his attention when they were trying to not be noticed. He thought about the cold air that had come out of the opening door. He thought about 1847 and the people who had carried things wrapped in oilcloth through the mountain autumn, building something meant to last, placing their trust in the idea that someone would eventually come who was paying enough attention to find what they had left. He picked up his field notebook and turned to the most recent page. He had not written an entry that day yet. He wrote the date in the upper left corner, the way he always did, and then below it he wrote a single sentence that he had been carrying in his head for several days without quite finding the right moment to set it down. It said, "What is kept carefully enough will eventually be found by someone who deserves to find it." He was not normally a person who wrote things like that. He was a person who wrote latitudes and longitudes and observed conditions and precise times. But it felt true in a way that the facts surrounding it had made room for, and he had learned a long time ago to write down the true things when they arrived. He closed the notebook and finished his coffee and went back to work. The weeks that followed moved in the way that consequential things often did once they were fully in motion, not quickly, but steadily, each development generating the next, each new piece of documentation opening another question that someone somewhere was already positioned to answer. Daniel tracked it all from the outpost, from the field station, from the ridge where he continued doing his regular survey work because the mountain did not stop requiring attention simply because something significant had been found in it. The independent archaeological assessment he had formally requested was now fully operational, with a team of 7 that rotated through the site on a schedule designed to maintain continuity without exhausting anyone. The cataloging of the chamber's contents was roughly a third complete. At that rate, it would be done in 4 months, possibly 5. The Heritage Authority had secured emergency funding for the work, partly through the Cultural Ministry and partly through an international organization that supported the preservation of sites of global historical significance. The chamber had been classified at that level within 2 weeks of Renata's first story. Daniel attended the meetings when he was asked to attend them. He answered questions when he was asked questions. He did not insert himself into decisions that were not his to make, and he did not absent himself from decisions where his knowledge of the site was necessary. He had found his position in the process, and it was the right one for the person he was. Dr. Ferreira came to the site once, spending 3 days with Tomas and Gabriela going through the documents from the chamber that were now stable enough for detailed examination. She moved through the material with a focused intensity that Daniel respected. She found things the others had cataloged but not yet contextualized, connections between documents in the chamber and documents in other archives, correspondences and cross-references that added density to the historical picture the registry had outlined. She told him, on the last evening of her visit, sitting outside the field station in the cooling air while the sun went down over the pines, that the chamber was going to change the way the mid-19th century in this region was understood. Not dramatically, she said, qualifying it in the way that honest scholars always did. The general outline of the period is already known. The major events, the political transitions, the institutional changes. What's in there is not going to overturn any of that. He waited. But the texture will change, she said. The granular understanding of how specific decisions were made and by whom and why. That kind of documentation is almost always missing from periods of political turbulence, because it's the first thing that disappears when institutions collapse or restructure. What we have in that chamber is evidence of how things actually worked at the operational level during a period when everyone assumed the operational records were gone. He thought about Raphael's observation, about the chamber being hidden not just physically but conceptually, about the people in 1847 using the assumption of loss as their most effective protection. They understood their moment better than we've given them credit for, he said. Dr. Ferreira nodded. People usually do. That's one of the things that archival work teaches you, if you let it. People in difficult historical moments were rarely as confused or as passive as later accounts suggest. They were making considered decisions under enormous pressure. This chamber is evidence of one of those decisions. He sat with that for a while. The sun had finished going down, and the stars were beginning to show. Renata published one more piece, several weeks after the bishop's letter story. This one was different in character from the first three, less focused on the specific legal and historical context, more reflective in its scope. She wrote about what the discovery meant in a broader sense, about the history of the region and the people who had lived in it, about what it meant for a community to have its historical record expanded and clarified after so many years of incompleteness. She quoted historians and archivists and indigenous scholars who had been contacted by the Heritage Authority as the contents of the chamber became known. She quoted Daniel once, briefly, near the end of the piece. He had told her, in one of their conversations, that the hardest part of the whole experience had not been finding the door or navigating the official pressures or waiting for the legal situation to resolve. The hardest part had been the 11 days before the registry was opened, knowing that something was there and not yet knowing what it was. The waiting. Renata had asked him what the waiting felt like. He had thought about it honestly and said that it felt like knowing something was true before you had the language to say it. The way the land sometimes communicated things before he had identified the specific evidence. An awareness that preceded understanding. She had written it down and used it, and reading it in the newspaper he thought it was as accurate a description as he had been able to produce. The family withdrew its legal claims 4 months after the registry was opened. The withdrawal was filed quietly, without a public statement, in the procedural way that legal retreats often were when the documentary basis of a position had been conclusively undermined. The Heritage Authority's communications office issued a brief note acknowledging the withdrawal. He noted it in his field notebook. Date, time, source. The way he noted everything. That evening he drove to the nearest town and sat in a small restaurant he had been going to for years. Ordered the same meal he always ordered there, and ate it slowly while the other diners talked around him about things that had nothing to do with limestone cliffs or 19th-century locks or the phrase assets held in trust for the public good. He felt, sitting there, the particular piece of a man who had done what he set out to do. Not the excited, energized piece of someone at the beginning of a project. The quieter, deeper piece of someone at its completion. The kind that settled into the bones rather than moving through the blood. He paid his bill and drove back to the outpost under a sky that was clear and full of stars. And he thought that this was what 19 years of paying attention had been for. Not this specific discovery, exactly, but the capacity to make it. The development of the particular quality of attention that could find a door in a cliff face and understand what it meant and do the right things with that understanding. He pulled into the outpost and turned off the engine and sat in the truck for a moment in the dark, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Tomorrow the survey route resumed. The mountain needed its regular reading. There would be erosion to log and signs of animal movement to note, and the quiet, endless work of paying attention to a landscape that most people never visited. He was glad it was his work. He had always been glad. Even in the difficult years when the truck needed repairs and the salary barely covered what it needed to cover, and the sense of being overlooked had some weight to it. He had been glad because the work itself was honest, and because the mountain was worth understanding, and because the act of attention, applied consistently, was not nothing. It accumulated. It built. It produced, eventually, the capacity to find a door in a cliff face and know what to do with what was on the other side. He got out of the truck and went inside and made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with his field notebook open to the next blank page. He wrote the date. He wrote the time. He wrote, chamber withdrawal confirmed. Legal position closed. Then he sat for a moment and wrote one more line below it. It said, the mountain kept it safe until it could be found. He closed the notebook and went to bed, and for the first time in 4 months he slept without interruption. And in the morning he put on his worn boots and walked back out into the light. The cataloging was completed on a Thursday in early spring, 5.5 months after the chamber was first opened. Daniel was not present for the final entry. He had been out on the Eastern Ridge Survey route, the same circuit he had been walking every third week for 19 years, the same path that had led him past the cliff face on that particular Tuesday in autumn when the light had caught the door in exactly the way that made it visible. He came back to the field station in the late afternoon to find Dr. Castellano and Tomas sitting outside in the mild air with coffee cups in their hands and the specific quality of stillness that descended on people who had just finished something large. He looked at them. "Done," Tomas said. Daniel sat down on the bench beside them and accepted the cup Dr. Castellano poured for him, and they sat together in the cooling afternoon without speaking for a while. The pine trees around the field station moving gently in a wind that carried the last of the winter cold in it, but also something warmer underneath, the first suggestion of the season turning. 147 entries, Tomas said eventually. Every one accounted for. Every item documented, described, assessed, cross-referenced. Daniel nodded. The final count, Dr. Castellano said, setting her cup down on the bench beside her, was this: 63 documents of historical significance, including 41 that were previously unknown to the archival record and had been listed in historical scholarship as lost or destroyed. 26 works of art and material culture, 11 of which appeared on lists of items missing from regional collections since the mid-19th century. 19 ceremonial and sacred objects from indigenous traditions of the Western Sierra region, their provenance now traceable through the registry entries. 12 financial instruments, specifically bearer bonds and promissory notes, issued between 1841 and 1847 by institutions whose successors still operated in recognizable form within the national banking system. She paused. "And 7 items that we have not yet been able to definitively categorize," she said. "Objects whose description in the registry is precise, but whose context requires further specialist assessment." "What kind of objects?" Daniel asked. She told him. He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote it in his field notebook, carefully, in the dry factual language he used for everything he recorded, because the importance of a thing and the drama of a thing were not the same thing, and he had long since learned to communicate one without performing the other. The financial instruments were the element that generated the most public attention in the weeks following the completion of the catalog. Not because they were the most historically significant, the documents and the artwork carried greater weight in terms of the archival record, but because their value was expressible in numbers that most people could immediately comprehend. The institutions whose successor organizations held liability for the original instruments had engaged their own legal teams and their own historians, and were in the process of determining what the obligations of successor institutions to instruments issued 176 years earlier actually were under current law. That question did not have a simple answer. Nothing about this situation had a simple answer. But the conversations were happening, formally and on the record, in a way they had not been happening before the chamber was opened. Daniel did not follow those conversations closely. They were important, and the right people were following them, but they lived in a domain of legal and financial analysis that was not his. His domain was the mountain, the ridge, the survey routes he walked with the same deliberate attention every third week regardless of what else was happening in the world. He did follow the conversations about the indigenous sacred objects. Those mattered to him in a different way, a more personal way that he found difficult to articulate, but did not feel the need to articulate, because some things did not require expression to be real. The Western Sierra region had indigenous communities that had maintained continuous presence in the high country for longer than any colonial archive recorded. Several of those communities had oral traditions and historical memories that mentioned sacred objects removed during periods of political disruption in the mid-19th century, objects that subsequent generations had grown up understanding as lost, as part of the story of what had been taken from their ancestors and not returned. The registry entries for the 19 ceremonial objects were specific enough that, when they were shared with community elders through the Heritage Authority's consultation process, several of the objects were recognized from those oral traditions. The recognition was not simple or uncomplicated. Objects that had been described in family histories, in ceremonial songs, in the remembered accounts of great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, suddenly existed again in the physical world, documented and real and accessible. That experience was not analogous to anything Daniel had words for. He sat in the consultation meeting where the elders were first shown the catalog photographs, and he watched the faces of people encountering something they had grown up understanding as permanently gone, and he did not try to describe what he saw because description would have reduced it. What he did was write down what was said, the names the elders used for the objects, the accounts they gave of what the objects had meant and what their removal had represented. He wrote it all in his field notebook in the same careful hand he used for everything else, and afterward he gave those pages to Dra. Castellano to include in the formal record of the consultation process. She had looked at him when he handed them over. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Someone should," he replied. She took the pages and added them to the file. The repatriation process for the indigenous objects was the longest and most complex of all the outcomes generated by the discovery. It involved community representatives, government agencies, the Heritage Authority, legal specialists in indigenous rights, and, at several points, the kind of patient mediation that required everyone to slow down and listen more carefully than institutions were typically structured to do. Daniel participated in that process at the level he was qualified to participate, providing testimony about the discovery and the condition of the objects as found, answering questions about the site and its physical characteristics, being present when his presence was useful and absent when it was not. The process took 2 years to reach its first substantial resolution, which was a formal agreement governing the eventual return of 14 of the 19 objects to the communities from which they had come. The remaining 5 required further assessment of provenance that would take additional time. The agreement was not perfect. Agreements of that kind were never perfect because they involved the intersection of legal systems and community traditions and historical claims that did not map neatly onto each other. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was the beginning of something that would continue after Daniel and everyone currently involved had moved on to other things. He attended the ceremony when the first 3 objects were transferred. It was held in the high country, not far from the ridge where he had found the door, on a clear day in early summer when the light came straight down through a sky so blue it looked almost artificial. He stood at the edge of the gathering and watched and listened and did not speak unless spoken to, which was how he had always understood his role in places and moments that were not primarily his. Afterward, one of the elders, an older woman with the particular quality of presence that comes from carrying a great deal of history in your own body, walked over to where he was standing and looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in careful Spanish, that her grandmother had told her about those objects when she was a child, that her grandmother's grandmother had told her grandmother, and so on back through the generations to people who had seen the objects removed and had never seen them returned. She said that she had grown up understanding that some things that were taken could not come back, that the loss had to be accepted and carried rather than resolved. She paused. She was not finished. "You found the door," she said. "That is what I was told. You found it because you were paying attention." He said that was right. She nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say that the right things waited for the right people. I thought that was something grandmothers said. Something comfortable, not something true." She looked at him steadily. "I understand now that it can be both," she said. And then she walked back to the gathering, and Daniel stood where he was for a while, looking at the mountain above him and the light on the trees and the sky that was almost too blue to believe. He wrote that down in his field notebook when he got back to the outpost. The whole of it. Every word he could remember. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The artwork proved to be the element that generated the most sustained scholarly attention. Of the 11 pieces identified as appearing on lists of missing items from the mid-19th century, 3 were subsequently confirmed to have been part of a regional collection that had been cataloged before the political disruption of 1847 and then simply vanished from the record. The assumption for nearly a century and a half had been that they were destroyed, possibly in the fires that had damaged several public buildings during the transition period, possibly removed and sold during the decades of instability that followed. They had been wrapped in oilcloth and placed on stone shelves in a sealed chamber in a cliff face, and they had waited there in the dark and the cold and the still air for someone to find them. The condition of all 3 was extraordinary. The sealed environment had protected them from humidity, from temperature fluctuation, from the kind of slow atmospheric deterioration that damaged artwork even in the best museum conditions. Conservators who were brought in to assess them spent their first morning in the field station in a state of professional agitation that Daniel found both understandable and slightly amusing, the particular excitement of experts encountering something they had studied primarily through historical reproductions suddenly manifesting as a physical object in front of them. One of the three pieces was a mid-19th century work by a painter whose other surviving works were held in national collections. It was known from catalog descriptions that a fourth work had existed, commissioned by the diocese during the same period, and it had been assumed lost. Finding it intact, in the original pigments, without the restoration work that the other three had required over the years, was, in the assessment of the conservators, a significant event in the history of the artist's documented output. Daniel did not know very much about art. He knew what he liked and did not spend a great deal of time elaborating the reasons. But he stood in the field station one afternoon, while two conservators were discussing the fourth painting in technical terms he mostly could not follow, and he looked at the work itself, propped carefully against the wall in its temporary housing, and he thought that whoever had placed it in that chamber in 1847 had understood they were protecting something worth protecting. That thought stayed with him for several days, recurring at odd moments, in the way that thoughts did when they were working towards something that had not yet fully formed. He was out on the Western Survey route, 3 weeks after the painting conversation, when it finally arrived. He had been thinking about the people of 1847 the way he sometimes thought about people whose decisions had shaped the landscape he walked, not personally or sentimentally, but with the respect that careful attention generated for careful action. They had made a plan. They had executed it precisely, with the right materials and the right construction and the right documentation. They had sealed the chamber, knowing they might never return, accepting that the future was uncertain, and acting on behalf of whoever would eventually arrive to open it. What had arrived was him, a man in worn boots with a field notebook and 19 years of quiet attention, walking a survey route on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. That was what had been waiting at the other end of their careful plan. He stopped on the ridge and looked out over the forest below, the same view he had been looking at for 19 years, and thought about the improbability of it. Not in any mystical sense. The improbability was real and mathematical and worth acknowledging. A different ranger on a different morning, walking the same route on a day when the light was different or the wind was blowing the debris against the cliff face in a way that obscured the door. Any of 100 ordinary variations, and the discovery did not happen. Not that day. Maybe not in his lifetime. He had been there on the right morning, paying attention in the right way, and that had been enough. He thought about his father again. He thought about his father's silence and the choice it represented, and he did not judge it, because he understood what it cost to speak and what it cost to stay quiet. And he understood that those costs were different for different people in different positions at different moments in history. His father had done what he had been able to do. Daniel had done what he had been able to do. The chain of it, the way one generation's silence could make the next generation's speaking more necessary, was not a simple story of failure and success. It was the ordinary way that things moved through time. The phone call came on a Monday morning in late summer, 14 months after the discovery. It was from an official at the cultural ministry whose name Daniel recognized from the communications he had been logging since the early weeks of the situation. The official's previous communications had been bureaucratic in character, concerned with procedure and jurisdiction and the management of information. This call was different. The official's voice carried the particular warmth of someone who was delivering news they had been looking forward to delivering. The ministry, the official said, in consultation with the Heritage Authority and the university partners who had been involved in the assessment of the site, had approved a formal proposal for the creation of a permanent research and preservation center at the Sierra site. The center would be based at the field station, expanded significantly, and would serve as a hub for ongoing study of both the chamber's contents and the broader archaeological and ecological significance of the region. Daniel listened carefully. The official continued. The center would require a site director, someone with deep knowledge of the terrain, established relationships with all the institutional partners involved, and a demonstrated commitment to the kind of work the center would be conducting. The position had been discussed at length, and there was consensus across all the relevant bodies that one name was the obvious choice. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I'm a ranger," he said. The official's response was brief and precise. The position, the official said, had been designed around the person who was most qualified to fill it, not around a pre-existing category. He asked for time to think. He took 3 days. He walked his survey routes. He sat at the flat rock on the ridge where he had waited for the heritage team to arrive that first day. He drove to the nearest town and ate at the small restaurant and thought about it over the same meal he always ordered. What he was thinking about was not primarily whether to accept. He had understood within the first hour of the call that he would accept, because it was the right work and he was the right person for it. And those two facts had a logic that was stronger than any hesitation. What he was thinking about was what accepting would mean, what it would change, what it would ask of him that the last 19 years had not asked. It would ask him to be present in a different way, more visible, more accountable to the processes of institutions in a way that the ridge and the survey routes had not required. It would ask him to speak in rooms full of people with more formal credentials and more institutional weight, to hold his ground in the way he had held it during the weeks of pressure after the discovery, but on a permanent basis, as a sustained practice rather than a response to a specific emergency. He thought about whether he was the kind of person who could do that. He thought about the morning on the ridge, the worn toe of his left boot, the quality of attention that had made him stop. He thought about the 40 photographs he had taken before leaving the chamber the first time. He thought about the field notebook he had maintained for 19 years, separate from the official duty log, because he had understood early that the official record needed a parallel. He thought about the elder woman at the transfer ceremony. The right things waited for the right people. I thought that was something grandmothers said. Something comfortable, not something true. I understand now that it can be both. On the fourth morning, he called the official back and accepted. The formal announcement came 2 weeks later. It was covered by Renata, who wrote a brief, accurate piece noting the appointment and its context within the ongoing work at the site. She quoted Daniel once, the same economy she had applied to all her coverage of this story, choosing the sentence that carried the most weight per word. He had told her, when she called to ask for comment, that the work was what mattered and the work was not finished. She had asked what he meant by not finished, and he had said that a discovery of this kind did not end with the cataloging or the legal resolution or the transfer of objects. It ended, if it ended at all, when the historical understanding it generated had been fully integrated into how people understood the period, the region, the landscape, and that process took decades, sometimes generations. She had written, Site director Daniel Arroyo said the work was not finished, and that a discovery of this kind did not end until its implications had been fully absorbed into how the past was understood. He estimated that would take decades. He read it and thought she had gotten it right. The center opened formally the following spring, at a ceremony that was modest by the standards of institutional events, but that felt significant to the people who were present, which was the only significance that mattered. Dr. Castellano spoke. Dr. Ferreira sent a recorded message from her university. Representatives from the indigenous communities attended, and 2 of the elders spoke, in their own languages, with translation provided. Osvaldo was there, standing at the edge of the gathering the way Daniel usually stood at the edge of gatherings, and Daniel caught his eye at one point, and they exchanged a nod that communicated more than either of them would have put into words. Renata was there too, with her notebook but not her recorder, which told him she was attending as herself rather than as a journalist, and he was glad of that. He spoke last. He had prepared what he wanted to say with the same care he applied to everything else, writing it out in the field notebook and then revising it twice, not because he was anxious about speaking, but because he wanted to be accurate about something that mattered, and accuracy required revision. He talked about the door. He talked about the morning he had found it, the quality of the light, the particular stillness of the cliff face, the hollow sound that had come out of the space when he pressed his palm against the wood. He talked about what it felt like to make a discovery that you understood immediately was larger than yourself, the specific quality of that experience, the way it generated not excitement exactly, but a kind of responsibility that settled into you and did not lift. He talked about the people of 1847 and what they had done and why he thought they had done it and what he believed they had hoped for. He said that the center was, in some sense, an answer to what they had hoped for. Not the only possible answer and not a complete one, but a real one, built on the evidence they had left and the care they had taken. He talked about his father briefly. He said only that his father had worked in these mountains and had understood them in ways that formal training had not given him, and that he hoped the work of the center would honor that kind of knowledge alongside the more officially credentialed kinds. He said that the mountain had kept something safe for a very long time, and that the job of the people in this room was to be worthy of that. Then he stopped speaking because everything necessary had been said. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The years that followed were not simple or clean in the way that endings and stories sometimes were. The center's work was ongoing and demanding and involved the full range of institutional friction that any ongoing work embedded in multiple overlapping bureaucracies involved. There were funding pressures and jurisdictional disputes and the slow, grinding pace of legal and academic processes that required patience as a professional skill rather than a personal virtue. Daniel navigated all of it. Not perfectly, not without frustration, but with the same consistent attention he had brought to the survey routes for 19 years. He had learned, during the months of the initial discovery and its aftermath, that the most effective response to pressure was not resistance but precision. To know exactly what was true and documented and to be able to articulate it clearly at any moment, in any room, was the most reliable protection available. He continued walking the survey routes, because the center's work was not separate from the landscape, but embedded in it. The ridge where the door had been found was now part of a protected research zone, its ecological and geological characteristics being documented with the same thoroughness that had been applied to the chamber's contents. The site was not just an archaeological discovery. It was a feature of a living landscape that was itself worth understanding. He hired a small staff for the center, 3 researchers and an administrator, chosen with care. He looked for people who had the quality he associated with good field work, not brilliance exactly, though none of them lacked for intelligence, but the specific combination of patience and precision and willingness to sit with a problem until it revealed itself rather than forcing a conclusion before the evidence was ready. He found what he was looking for in each of them, in different proportions and through different histories, but recognizable. The center published its first research report 18 months after opening, a detailed study of the chamber's construction that drew on the geologist's assessments and the architectural analysis from Dr. Castellano's team and the historical documentation from Tomas and Dr. Ferreira. The report was published in an academic journal and received the kind of attention within specialized scholarly circles that such reports received, which was not wide public attention but was the right kind for its purpose. Daniel read the report carefully when it appeared, checking it against what he knew from his own observations and finding it accurate in every detail he could verify. He wrote a brief note to each of the authors, not elaborate or effusive, just specific and honest, noting the elements he found most valuable. He had learned that specificity was the form of recognition that mattered most to people who did serious work. Tomas replied that Daniel's note was the one he was going to keep. The chamber itself was now accessible to researchers under a controlled protocol that limited access to protect the space while ensuring it could be studied. The outer door, the original one Daniel had pulled open with a half-turn of an iron ring on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, had been preserved in place and was the subject of a detailed conservation assessment. The inner door was displayed in a small exhibit at the field station, alongside photographs of the chamber interior and reproductions of several of the most significant registry entries, translated and annotated. Visitors came, not in large numbers, because the site required a 3-kilometer walk from the trailhead and was not accessible to anyone who was not prepared to make that effort. But the people who came because they genuinely wanted to understand something, and that quality of attention was worth more than volume. Daniel sometimes walked the trail to the site with groups of researchers or students or journalists, not as a guide exactly, because the trail was well marked now and did not require guidance, but as a companion who knew the context in the way that 19 years of presence in a landscape could generate. He found that the questions people asked on the trail were often better than the questions they asked in conference rooms, because the physical experience of moving through the mountain and arriving at the cliff face and seeing the door set into the stone generated a different kind of curiosity than sitting with documents in a heated building. The question he was asked most often, in one form or another, was some version of, "How did you know to stop?" He answered it differently depending on who was asking, because the true answer had multiple components and different people needed different parts of it. To researchers, he talked about the accumulated pattern recognition of long field work, The way consistent attention to a landscape built a baseline against which anomalies registered without requiring conscious analysis. To students, he talked about the discipline of slowing down, of not letting the familiar become invisible simply because it was familiar. To journalists, he said what he had said to Renata, that when something looked like it was meant to be overlooked, the first question was why. All of those answers were true. None of them was complete. The complete answer was something he did not say in those conversations, because it was harder to explain and easier to misread. The complete answer was that he had stopped because he had been paying attention for 19 years not to any particular thing, but to everything. And that kind of attention, sustained over time, created a capacity that was not analyzable into component parts. It was a whole that was larger than its pieces. You could not manufacture that capacity by walking a survey route once. You built it by walking it again and again, by caring about what you found there even when nothing remarkable occurred, by treating the landscape as a thing worth attending to in itself rather than as a background against which events occasionally happened. He had built it over 19 years without knowing that was what he was building. And on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, it had produced the moment that the rest of his life would be organized around. He thought about that sometimes, in the particular way he thought about things that had no resolution, turning them over without expecting them to settle. The relationship between patience and discovery, between the long, ordinary work and the singular moment, between his father's silence and his own speaking, between 1847 and the morning he had crouched down and pressed his palm against a door that had been waiting 176 years for that exact pressure. There was no conclusion to reach about those relationships. They were simply what they were, the texture of how things actually moved through time, which was not linearly or dramatically, but in the slow accumulation of attention and care and the moments when those things were suddenly and unexpectedly enough. 3 years after the discovery, Daniel stood on the flat rock on the eastern ridge, the same rock where he had sat waiting for the heritage team to arrive on that first day. The center was operating behind him at the field station, the researchers working in the expanded space, the administrator managing the schedule of visits and consultations and correspondence that was now the center's daily rhythm. The legal processes were largely resolved. The repatriation process was ongoing and productive. The scholarly work was published and was being read and was changing, in the incremental way that scholarship changed things, how the mid-19th century in this region was understood. The hawk was there. Again, or a different hawk, or the idea of a hawk that this landscape generated at the moments when he was still enough to notice it. Circling the thermal above the open slope to the south, exactly as it had always circled, indifferent to everything below it, and therefore somehow a comment on everything below it. He looked at the cliff face. The outer door was visible now from this angle, if you knew what you were looking at. It had always been there, always visible, always waiting to be seen. The concealment had never been perfect. It had only needed to be good enough until someone came who was paying attention in the right way. He thought about everything that had come out of that door. The documents that were restoring detail to a historical period that had seemed permanently incomplete. The artwork that was back in the light after a century and a half in the dark. The sacred objects being returned to the communities they had come from. The financial questions being worked through in the slow, careful way that such questions required. The center doing the ongoing work of understanding the landscape as a whole, not just its most dramatic feature. He thought about the registry and its careful handwriting and its 147 entries and the phrase at its head that had stayed with him since the morning Gabriella first read it aloud in the hushed chamber. Assets held in trust for the public good. He thought about what trust meant across a span of time so long that the people who placed it could not have imagined the world in which it would be received. About the faith required to build something that carefully for people you would never meet. About the kind of care that persisted after the people who had exercised it were gone. He thought about his father and the mountains and the 19 years and the morning in early autumn and the cold air that had come out of the door like something finally allowed to breathe. He sat on the flat rock and looked at the landscape he had been looking at for most of his adult life, the dark mass of the pines below the ridge, the limestone cliff face with its long water stain and its small concealed door, the sky above the mountains that was, on this particular afternoon, exactly the same profound blue it had been on the morning of the discovery, as if the sky had no more variety in it than that one color. repeated until it became the only color there was. He opened his field notebook to the current page. He wrote the date in the upper left corner. He wrote the time. He wrote, Eastern Ridge, clear, wind light from the north. He looked up at the cliff face. He looked at the door. He wrote, everything that was placed here in care has been received in care. The work continues. He closed the notebook and sat for a while longer, listening to the mountain, which had nothing new to say and did not need to, because what it had already said was enough to last a very long time. Then he stood and put the notebook in his jacket pocket and started back down the trail toward the field station, toward the work, toward the people doing it alongside him, toward the long, ordinary days that were the real substance of everything. His boots finding the path without effort, the sky above him clear and enormous and entirely indifferent, and therefore somehow, in the way that certain kinds of indifference were, the most honest thing in view. He walked back down the mountain into his life, and the mountain remained exactly what it had always been, patient and enormous and full of things that were waiting, in the way that all true things eventually waited, for the right person to arrive at the right moment, and finally, carefully, let them out into the light. The seasons changed twice more before Daniel fully understood what the discovery had done to him. Not to his career or his circumstances or his public profile. Those changes were visible and documentable, and he had written them all down in his field notebook with dates and times attached. What it had done to him as a person was slower and harder to name and arrived, as most real changes did, not as an event, but as a gradual recognition of something that had already happened. He noticed it first in the way he slept. For 19 years he had been a light sleeper, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone who lived alone in a remote outpost and had learned to process environmental sounds in his sleep, distinguishing between the ordinary and the irregular without fully waking. After the discovery, after the legal situation resolved and the center opened and the daily rhythm of the work settled into something sustainable, the sleep changed. It went deeper. He woke less. He had dreams that he remembered in the morning, full and coherent and occasionally interesting, rather than the fragmentary half-impressions that were all he had been catching for years. He mentioned this to Dr. Castellano once, at the end of a long meeting day when they were both tired enough to be more honest than usual. She had looked at him with an expression he could not quite categorize. You were carrying something, she said, for a long time, and now it's somewhere else. He thought about that for several days. He thought about the years of careful attention in a landscape that most people never saw, the survey routes and the field notes, and the separate notebook maintained alongside the official duty log, because he had understood early that the two were not the same thing. He thought about the weight of that understanding, the sense of being responsible for accuracy in a context where accuracy was not always rewarded or even noticed. He had been carrying it. She was right. And now it was in the center, in the research and the publications and the repatriation agreements and the ongoing work of people who had come from other places because of what had been found in this mountain. The thing he had been responsible for was now being held by a structure larger than him, and that structure would continue after he was gone, maintaining the responsibility he had originally taken on alone. He understood, sitting with that realization, why the sleep had changed. The center attracted a particular kind of person in its first years, not just researchers, but people who had heard the story and been drawn by something in it that they were not always able to articulate precisely. He met a retired schoolteacher from the southern coast who had driven 4 hours to walk the trail to the site because she had read Renata's original article and wanted to see the door for herself. She was in her 70s and walked slowly and carefully and spent a long time standing in front of the outer door without speaking. When she finally turned to Daniel, who had happened to be walking the trail that day, she said only that she had taught her students for 30 years that some things could not be recovered, that the historical record was permanently incomplete in certain ways, and that she was going to have to revise that lesson. He was glad she told him. He wrote it in his field notebook. He met a graduate student from another country who had come to spend a semester working with the center's research team. She was writing her dissertation on the preservation practices of diocesan institutions during periods of political instability in 19th century Latin America, a subject that had existed as a scholarly field before the Sierra discovery, but that the discovery had now given a concrete and richly documented case study. She was precise and hard-working and asked good questions and was visibly moved. in the restrained way that serious scholars often were, by the quality of the construction she encountered in the chamber. She said to Daniel one afternoon, while they were both looking at the outer door in the late light, that the thing she kept coming back to was the confidence of it. The people who built this were not hedging, she said. They were not building something that might last if conditions were favorable. They were building something that would last regardless. That kind of confidence requires a very specific relationship to the future. He had thought about that for a long time afterward. The confidence of it. The way the construction communicated not hope but certainty. The certainty of people who had decided that the future was worth building for even when the present was frightening and uncertain. He thought about what it took to be that certain. Not arrogance, because arrogance built carelessly. This had been built with extraordinary care, every joint tight, every beam true, every mechanism precisely machined. Certainty about the value of what they were protecting, perhaps. About the fact that someone would eventually arrive who was capable of receiving it. About the permanence of truth even when the people who knew it were gone. He thought about the registry with its 147 entries and its careful handwriting and its phrase at the top of the first page. Assets held in trust for the public good. That phrase was the certainty made explicit. They knew what they were doing and why, and they said so clearly, so that whoever opened the chamber would understand immediately that this was not hidden wealth, not private accumulation, not the product of theft or greed or secrecy for its own sake. It was a trust, a responsibility transferred across time. And Daniel had received it, not because he was chosen or special or positioned by fate, because he had been paying attention on a Tuesday morning in early autumn when the light was right, and he was walking a route he had walked dozens of times before, and his eyes had registered something that his mind recognized as wrong in the right way, and he had stopped. That was all. That was the whole of it. And yet, sitting on the flat rock above the valley with the mountain behind him and the work of the center proceeding below, it felt like enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that did not require addition. He thought about the conversations he had heard in the diner in town over the years, the other men talking about margins and investments and equipment and expansion, the confident language of people whose measure of progress was legible in numbers. He had never belonged to those conversations. He had always sat at the edge of them, eating his meal, listening without contributing, understanding that what he valued and what they valued were simply different things, and that the difference was not a judgment on either side. But he noticed now, in the years after the discovery, that those conversations had a different quality when he was part of them. Not that the subject changed. The practical concerns of people doing practical work did not change simply because the person at the table had found something significant in a cliff. But the register shifted slightly. People listened differently, asked different questions, waited to hear what he thought rather than filling the space before he could. He had not changed. The work he valued was the same work he had always valued. What had changed was the world's understanding of what that work produced when it was done with consistent care over a long period of time. The survey routes, the field notes, the separate notebook, the 19 years of paying attention to a landscape that most people never visited. Those things had always been the same. They looked different now because of what they had led to, but they had not become different. They had only become visible. He thought that was worth understanding clearly, because it was easy to reach. The wrong conclusion. The wrong conclusion was that the discovery validated the work, that the work had been worthwhile because it produced something significant. The right conclusion was that the work had been worthwhile all along, that 19 years of careful attention to a landscape was a good way to spend 19 years regardless of what it produced, and that the discovery was not the justification of the work, but its fruit, which was a different thing. Fruit was what happened when you tended something correctly over time. It was not the reason for the tending. The reason for the tending was the thing itself. He had tended the mountain because the mountain was worth tending. The door had been there. He had found it. Those two facts were connected by the 19 years, but they were not the same fact, and keeping that distinction clear mattered to him in a way he could not fully explain but did not need to. He was not a man who needed to fully explain everything. Some things were clear enough without explanation. Some things were clear enough without expression. He had learned, over a life spent mostly in his own company in a landscape that did not require conversation, to distinguish between the things that needed to be said and the things that needed only to be understood. What needed to be said, he said, carefully and specifically, in field notebooks and official reports and testimony, and the remarks he gave at the center's opening ceremony. What needed only to be understood, he carried with him on the survey routes. In the early mornings before the field station opened. In the evenings, sitting outside the outpost watching the light change on the ridge. The mountain was what it had always been. He was what he had always been. The discovery had not changed either of those things. It had simply made the connection between them visible to the world in a way it had not been before. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than most people got, and he understood that, and he was grateful for it in the quiet way he was grateful for most things, without elaborate expression, as a settled fact rather than an ongoing performance. He stood from the flat rock on the ridge and looked at the cliff face and the door one more time. The afternoon light was going now, the long shadows of the pine trees stretching east across the ground, the air beginning to carry the particular cold of high-altitude evenings that arrived earlier and left later than at any elevation he had ever lived at before. He thought about the woman from the ceremony, her grandmother's words. The right things waited for the right people. He thought about the door and the cold air and the date in the mortar and the lock that had held for 176 years. He thought about the registry and its 147 entries and the work that was still going on inside the mountain and outside it, and in the journals and the archives and the consultation rooms where slow, careful people were doing the slow, careful work of receiving what had been placed in trust. He thought about his father and the mountains and the silence and what the silence had cost and what it had preserved and how both of those things were true at the same time without canceling each other out. He thought about the work. The ordinary, daily, undramatic work of paying attention to a landscape that deserved to be attended to. The work that had been his for 19 years and would be his, in its expanded form, for as long as he could do it. He picked up his field notebook. He opened it to the current page. He looked at what he had already written. Eastern Ridge, clear, wind light from the north. Everything that was placed here in care has been received in care. The work continues. He read it once more. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his jacket pocket and started down the trail. The field station lights were on below him, warm in the cooling evening, the researchers still at their work, the mountain holding everything it had always held, the door in the cliff face barely visible now in the failing light, patient and ordinary and full of what it had kept safe. He walked down through the pines and the fading light and the sounds of the high country settling into evening. And he thought that 19 years was a long time to spend paying attention to something, and that it had been exactly the right amount of time, and that whatever came next would ask the same thing of him that everything before had asked, which was simply to keep paying attention, carefully and specifically, and without expecting the landscape to explain itself before it was ready. He had learned to be patient with that. He had learned it over 19 years and one Tuesday morning in early autumn, and he carried it with him now the way he carried his field notebook, as something ordinary and essential and already his. Some months after the center's second anniversary, Daniel received a letter. Physical mail, which was unusual enough that he noticed the envelope before he noticed the return address. It was handwritten, in Spanish, on plain paper. It had been forwarded through the Heritage Authority's main office, and then through Osvaldo, and then through the field station administrator before reaching him, which suggested the sender had gone to some effort to find him. The letter was from an elderly man in another province who had read all of Renata's articles and then done considerable research on his own. He was in his 80s, he said. His grandfather had worked as a laborer in the Sierra region in the early 20th century and had spoken, when the old man was a child, of hearing stories from other old men about something sealed into a mountain during the years of trouble. The stories had been vague and had been passed down the way things were passed down among people without formal education or official standing, in fragments, in the margins of other conversations, without confidence that they would be believed. The old man wrote that he had spent most of his adult life believing those stories were legend. That mountains accumulated legends the way certain people accumulated debts, out of a kind of cultural necessity rather than any relationship to actual events. He had considered his grandfather's account one of those legends. He wrote that reading about the chamber and the door and the registry had changed that. He did not have anything to add to the historical record, he said. He had no documents, no photographs, no artifacts. What he had was the knowledge that the stories his grandfather had carried were not legend. They were memory. And that distinction, he wrote, was worth more to him than he could express in a letter. He thanked Daniel for finding the door. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he sat at his kitchen table for a long while, not writing, not doing anything, just sitting with it. He thought about the thousands of people who lived in the broad region around the Sierra and the decades and generations in which the stories about the mountain had circulated in fragments, at kitchen tables, in the margins of other conversations, without confidence that they would be believed. He thought about how many of those people had carried something similar to what the old man had described, a partial memory, a family account, a legend that might or might not be true, with no way to know. The chamber's opening had not just produced historical documents and returned sacred objects and resolved legal disputes. It had also, in the way that confirmed truths always did, validated the memory of people whose memory had no official standing. It had told the old man and people like him that what their grandparents said was real, that the stories passed down in fragments were not invention, that the mountains held what people said they held. That was not a small thing. He understood that it was not a small thing. He wrote back to the old man. He wrote a real letter, not a brief acknowledgement. He told the man what the chamber had contained, in the kind of specific detail that the published reports provided, but that felt different when communicated directly, one person to another. He told him that the stories from his grandfather's time were accurate, that people had known about the mountain's secret and had carried that knowledge forward without the means to confirm it, and that the confirmation had arrived at last, even if it had taken longer than any of them could have anticipated. He told the man that the center would be glad to include his account in its oral history archive, if he was willing to share it, that the archive existed specifically for memories like his, which had no documentary support, but which were part of the same history that the documents recorded, approached from a different angle. The old man replied within 2 weeks. He said yes. He said he had a great deal more to tell. Daniel passed his contact information to the center's oral history researcher, a young woman named Camila who had joined the staff in the center's 2nd year and who had a particular gift for the kind of listening that drew people's memories out without distorting them. Camila made the trip to the old man's province and spent 3 days with him, recording everything he remembered and everything he had been told and everything he had wondered about over 8 decades of carrying a story he was not sure was true. The resulting archive entry was one of the longest in the collection and one of the most valuable, not for the specific facts it contained, though it contained several that proved useful in cross-referencing with the documentary record, but for the quality of the memory itself. The way that historical knowledge survived in communities without formal institutions to preserve it. The particular texture of a story passed down across 4 generations, what it retained and what it lost, and what it transformed in the transmission, and what that pattern said about both the event it described and the people who had carried it. Camila presented the findings at a conference the following year. Daniel attended. He sat in the back of the room and listened to her speak about the old man's account and what it represented, and he thought about the letter, the handwriting, the effort the man had made to find a way to reach him. He thought about all the letters he would never receive, from all the people who had no words for what the confirmation of their family's memory meant, or who had no way to find him, or who simply kept the knowledge quietly the way people often kept the most important things, folded into the daily work of living, not requiring expression to be real. He thought about his father again, for what felt like the 10,000th time since the morning of the discovery, about the thing his father had found and been told not to include in the official record, and had not included, and had mentioned at the kitchen table for the rest of his life, about what his father had been carrying all those years, and what it had meant to him to carry it, whether it had felt like weight or like a kind of private wealth, the knowledge of something seen that others had not seen. He had never been able to ask his father that question. His father was gone before Daniel had found the door, before he had understood what the question meant. But he thought about it often, and he thought that it was probably both, the weight and the wealth, in proportions that shifted depending on the day and the season and how much else a person was carrying at the time. He understood that now in a way he could not have understood it before. The discovery had not relieved him of weight so much as it had changed the character of what he was carrying. The field notebook was still in his jacket pocket. The survey routes still needed walking. The mountain still required the kind of attention that 19 years had prepared him to give. None of that had changed. What had changed was that the carrying was no longer solitary. The work was embedded now in something larger that would continue, and that changed the quality of the daily effort in a way that was difficult to name but easy to feel. In the sleep that had gone deeper and the mornings that arrived with less effortfulness and the particular satisfaction of work that was not only its own reward, but was visibly part of something that mattered beyond the person doing it. He walked out of the conference building into the afternoon of a city he visited only occasionally, blinking slightly in the light after hours indoors. The street was busy with people moving at the pace that city people moved, purposeful and slightly pressured. The sounds of traffic and voices layered into the particular texture of urban noise that he had grown unaccustomed to in the years at the outpost. He stood on the pavement for a moment and felt the familiar mild disorientation of someone whose natural habitat was quiet, surrounded by the noise of a world that operated on a different frequency. Then he put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the familiar weight of the field notebook, and the disorientation passed, because the notebook was the same whether he was on the ridge or on a city street, and its presence was enough to remind him of who he was and where the work lived. He walked to the station and took the train back toward the mountains. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.